Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Governance Forum 2026. Welcome to London. We're on red alert in London for the heat warning. The UN Secretary General said yesterday that that London is cooking. He wanted to say that London will be cooking because the red alert starts today, but the team said that cooking sounded better, and that indeed got the headline yesterday. But it was, of course, a very evidence-based speech from the UN Secretary General yesterday. And this room is, of course, full of people who really work on the governance, the evidence, and really think hard about the solutions and how we drive those over this project that is both a sprint and a marathon. So thank you for being here. We do, of course, have not only extreme heat in London, but we also have over 1,300 climate action events taking place through the week. So London really is showing also that cooperation is happening, is continuing to happen in a fractured and hot world. So thank you for being part of that. Turning to the governance question, Guterres also set the frame around the twin crises that we are facing, the energy crisis and the climate crisis, and that they have the same root in fossil fuels. He said that the clean energy transition is inevitable, but that the transition must be managed well in order to be fair, in order to be resilient. And that's really where, of course, governance comes in and doing that well. So again, this is a really relevant question and mandate for this room and this forum to take forward today. For it to be fair and well managed and resilient, we need to make choices. We need to think collectively, think hard about the solutions and how we manage some of the difficult trade-offs. I also think that there is a question for governance, not just an answer from governance, which is part of it, but also a question for governance, which is how do we ensure that the governance is politically resilient in these fractured times. So the question for this forum, in my mind, is also how do we ensure that it's politically, socially, economically resilient through many, many years. Yesterday at Mansion House, we hosted the State of Climate Politics Forum, and really for E3G, my organisation, we work at that intersection of the politics and the governance of climate. Governance can, of course, do some of the hard work of holding structures and processes across many years through political cycles. It can force us to think about future generations or remind us to do so when we're making decisions. But it must also, of course, be politically resilient at the end. This forum was created last year, building on many decades of work by many people in this room, many different organizations, many leaders. And really the conviction was that we need to come together and think both about scale. We need to learn from each other because we need to act at pace. We need to share experience and take lessons from one place and see how they can be translated into another place. The International Climate Councils Network co-host, and you'll hear more from Ben and from colleagues shortly, and through the program, was really created to enable that kind of exchange between these very important in climate governance bodies, climate councils that have really emerged very strongly and which, you know, in many ways started where we are today in Westminster with the Climate Change Act and the creation of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, which remains in place today. So the scale of the challenge is global. That requires us to work together, to learn lessons, to share practice. There's also enormous amounts of innovation that will be continued through the coming decades, because the scale of the transformations is going to require not just more of the good stuff, but also different ways of doing things, different ways of working. So I think we also have a challenge to work together around transformation and innovation. Climate governance is still a young field. I've been practicing in the climate governance field for about 25 years. It is still very much a developing and evolving field. If you look at the Climate Change Act, which is looked at as one of the landmark pieces of legislation, it's just over 20 years old. You can go back further, of course, into some of the major environmental legislation through starting in the US and elsewhere in the 70s. But really, it's a young field. So that innovation, that living of the governance is still very, very real. I wanted to comment on the innovation piece because I think sometimes we think that means that everything has to be new and new ideas pop up all the time, which is amazing and remarkable. But a lot of the innovation can also happen within the frameworks that we already have. And as a public interest lawyer, part of the job was to really always to think about creatively, how could we use existing frameworks? How could we think about implementation and enforcement differently? There is innovation in all of those spaces. I've also seen how existing frameworks can also respond to some of the new challenges and to some of the new evidence. And the International Court of Justice decision is a really great example of that body of evidence. How does the law, how do institutions respond to that and step up to protect people, to protect economies? But we also know that there can be real barriers, that there can be incumbency, that the governance is where a lot of the power relationships and inertia also reside. So what I want to say for this forum is that the innovation is going to come both from within the existing frameworks and where we need to introduce new things. And again, in the program today, you'll hear from for both of those things. So this forum is the place to bring the ecosystem together. I also want to welcome this morning those who are joining us online. This is a place where policymakers, people involved in governance, business, academia, civil society can come together to work across boundaries and to strengthen the field. We're in the right place. We're at the right moment for that conversation. So welcome to London Climate Action Week. Welcome to the Climate Governance Forum. I'm going to hand to Ben Rhodes, the head of the International Climate Council's Secretariat, for some opening remarks, and then we'll move into the main program. There is, I think, just by way of housekeeping, we've got Izzy and Elizabeth on hand for any questions, any practical questions that you need through the agenda. We will have lunch at the end. If you need water to take a break, please do. And we will, sorry, what's that? Okay, great. This is what I mean about innovative and quick-footed. Get the memo. We're going to move to Gina McCarthy first, so let me move on to that. I just wanted to say you do have a QR code to get the agenda for today. So if you want to access that, please do see it. Right, I am now going to move on to introduce Gina. As our first keynote speaker. We are honoured and delighted that you are joining us in London and that you're joining us at the Climate Governance Forum. You have been a leader for many, many years in the US. I'm sure you will speak to us about your own reflections on decades of building and living climate governance and how do we respond to the current challenges. So welcome to Gina McCarthy.
I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry, so it was very nice of Carla to move the conversation forward. Hopefully I'll have some sound remarks to give to all of you guys, but I really just came here to thank you, to recognize all of the work you're doing. You know, I'm impressed by the work, and Carla, thank you for the introduction. I'm impressed by the work of this group, E3G, and I really wanted to be able to at least spend some time to talk to you about it and to, you know, get a better feel for the challenges that you're facing and the challenges, frankly, that we all can work on together. And I have to thank all of the International Climate Council's network for giving me a chance to speak with you today. because it really is an honor to kick off this conversation. And it's a privilege to be with really so many smart and strategic thinkers, like who care about the world we live in and the people that we hold dear. After all, that is, I think, what most of us work for. So I also want to recognize and thank all of the international friends who are in the room and have been with us in the trenches as we navigate the difficulties in my country. The difficulties, I guess is what we call it, huh? It's the troubles. I knew that sounded familiar. That's very English of you. And I'm enormously grateful for all of your willingness to listen to me and for continuing to give my country, my American friends, and myself a seat at the table. I know that's not something that you need to do, but I appreciate it because I'm really interested in continuity here. I'm interested in continuing to work together, and I think those opportunities are still before us, and we have to capture them. But I think we all know that my federal government is not here, and I'm happy about that right now. But our governors and mayors, they are here, and I'm really happy about that now because they're essential partners, you know, at times like these. They help to ensure that we have a continuity, that we're all looking at creating venues and opportunities like this one, and assuring folks, honestly, that we are keeping our doors open, we are doing our best to get creative, to work both within the UN negotiating framework as well as outside it. Because we all know that good government isn't just domestically focused. It's about building frameworks beyond national governments. It's about moving forward to insulate ourselves from political whims that we are seeing right now, which is why I'm so thankful for the decades of diplomacy and commitment to multilateralism that we represent today. It's important for us to recognize that as we move forward with local leaders, as we look at our non-governmental institutions, we must recognize that they have been the ones that have allowed us to keep a lot of our relationships alive. And that's what we must continue to do. You know, and before I go too far, I have to recognize that my federal government is no longer listening to science or following the law, and it's painful for me to actually have to see this. But the hell with them, we have work to do, which is why I'm grateful to everyone here. We need your wisdom, we need your tenacity, we need your help. In fact, the world needs your help. So please keep doing the things that help all of us translate climate politics into real world action. We can dwell on politics all we want, but the only thing that matters are the actions that we take. The only thing that matters is our ability to understand that science is real, it's important, and our work together to collaborate is the only thing that is going to keep us moving forward. So I thank you for everything we're doing, but let me be clear. I'm not trying to sort of dump the climate challenge on you guys to solve. You know, that task falls on all of us. But the common thread that really underpins all the dangers that we face these days is leaving ourselves exposed to the volatility of our reliance on dirty fossil fuels to power our global energy systems. I firmly believe that is not just about advancing clean energy, but is recognizing that dirty energy must go. We have only a time-limited ability to save our kids and our grandkids. That's what we have to do, and it's a difficult thing to do. But we must recognize that in life, these challenges come before us, and we have to soon say goodbye to fossil fuels and yippee hooray to clean energy, because that's what's going to keep us moving forward. You know, I've always done work that protects people's health from pollution. It's really been a through line of what I do. And I've worked for 6 governors and 2 presidents. I'm a real fly-by-night. You know, I'm getting older every day, and I got to make this stuff work now. I got to stop jumping around and talking about things, and we need to get stuff done. And I know that this work has never been easy, right? Never been easy, and it never will be. But it's a good thing to do. It's a way to make you feel like you have a life worth living instead of a life of dread every morning the phone rings, or every morning that when we see a press release that we cannot tolerate. And I can remember working for more than 3 years to pass what we called the Clean Power Plan. I was EPA administrator at the time. And the Clean Power Plan was all about reducing emissions, setting regulatory standards for basically clean power. And I can remember all of the disagreements we had. I can remember also that it took us more than 2 years to get that regulation proposed. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because the fight was over clean energy for sure and how much transition needed to be made. But within moments, the Supreme Court literally killed it. But what I will tell you is this: in that moment between this moving forward and the Supreme Court killing it, the industry changed what they were doing. The industry already understood from the lengthy 2 years of discussions at tables that we had to move forward together, that the time was now to start reducing our emissions in the power sector. And so change happens. It can be slowly, but man, when you also get it crushed and they're still doing what you wanted, that's a hip, hip hooray. And that's because we worked together. We struggled together. Look, many of these people in this room, you do the same things, all of the hard work and dedication. You know, EPA really moved forward with as many strong policies as we could to actually understand that human beings needed more affordable options. They needed us to move together. In fact, our colleagues at the University of Maryland now at the Center for Global Sustainability have been showing us that in the US, renewable generation surpassed coal last year. And solar increased nearly tenfold. While wind doubled over in the last decade, coal generation has fallen by 50%. So we are making progress. So as I'm sitting there looking out, trying to understand why this hall isn't filled with really young people who can stand up and we can shake their hands, that's what we have to do. We need to excite them. We need to tell them that this is not a struggle. This is a struggle we can win. This is an opportunity for us to stand together and actually drive their future in a way that young people are demanding, because we have to. You know, I'm 72 years old. I don't have to stand here and listen to my little 8-year-old daughter tell me that it's really hot out today, Nana. You know, it's really hot out. You better put your hat on. This is what I'm hearing now, right? This is what we have to face. This is personal. It is not political. This is life-saving. This is what this is all about. And you guys have done such a good job at collaborating together. So I want to thank everybody for the work that you've been doing. Look, we have states that are really acting in everybody's best interests. You know, I'm a manager right now at America is All In. It's an initiative that really captures state and local leaders who actually represent 2/3 of the US population and 3/4 of the US GDP. And we are floating around everywhere at these opportunities to actually make sure that people know that we are still in, that we are working hard, that we have our hand on the what is most important in terms of what we're doing at the state and local level, so that the promises we've made can really lead to a clean energy revolution. So none of us are here, obviously, from the United States to claim success. We're here to assure you that we're going to keep fighting. We're here to assure you that we're standing with you. We're not going to avoid the reality at home. We're going to just do everything humanly possible to get past it. to show the world that the United States is in. And I could not be more excited about the work that's going on at the state level. Do you realize that Texas leads the country in wind and solar? Texas. They hate us. But yet, they say nothing about clean energy or climate, but they are raking in the dough because they're doing the right thing and investing in the right way. So great for them. That's what we should all be doing. California, as we all know, with Gavin Newsom as the governor, it's the 4th largest economy in the world, and it saw its emissions go down 21% since 2000. And that was at the same time as the GDP grew 81%. And we can talk about Maryland, we can talk about the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, all of this stuff where good things are moving. So after many years in government, I stand here asking you right now to work with us, to make us feel like we're a collaboration again, to make us understand that this is a global fight. And each of us needs to stand tall and grab that future. So I want what everybody else wants, folks, I think, sitting here. I want a healthier, safer, and more equitable future for our kids and our grandkids. And it's my hope that we can and we will work together to deliver on that promise. So thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Gina. We greatly appreciate that, and that is remarkable resilience right there. We are going to catch up with the agenda and move now to our first panel discussion. So I'm delighted to invite Halldór Thorgilsson from the Icelandic Climate Council, and previously has held senior roles at the UNFCCC, and is perfectly discussed to take us through a conversation on governance and multilateralism and the rule of law.
Much, and it's a great honor to be asked to kick this conversation off. And what better start could we have than having listened to Gina? And there are 3 keywords that I took away from her reflection: is importance of continuity, the value of multilateralism, and the imperative to really deliver real-world actions. And this is what we are all about. I'm particularly interested in this panel, having worked both in building global governance arrangements, but now working at the national level. And that's what this focus is of this conversation is on, very much connecting what happens at the international level, knowing that climate change is the ultimate global issue and demands global solutions, but with also where the key action has to happen in the real world at the national level. So we're not creating a dichotomy here between the global and the national, but looking at the synergy between the two. And we have a wonderful panel, as I introduce you, I wish to invite you up here. First, a friend of mine, Ambassador Ali Mohammed from Kenya. He is the special envoy on climate change in the executive office of the president of Kenya. Just pick a seat that looks appealing to you. He is a well-known environment and development expert. But I particularly appreciate his role in as a coordinator of the African group of negotiators. And for those of you that have some understanding of the complexity of the climate negotiations, the coordination of regional groups is really what holds everything together. And he did a stellar job in chairing that very important group. He has also worked with the Global Center for Adaptation, and now I will embarrass him because he has been listed as among the top 100 most influential Africans. Welcome him. Next, could I invite Laura Clark? Clark, is that how I put it? And she is from Client Earth, which is an international legal environmental charity. And she has been a CEO there, started there in 22. And you might know their work in litigation, very well-known cases in terms of the Shell Board of Directors, Cargill, not a small company there, working with us. But I understand that you have also now moved more into advocacy work and to ensure that the right legal frameworks are put in place. And the last member of the panel is Kath Rowley. She comes from down under, as we say. She is the CEO of the Climate Change Authority in that wonderful country. She has wealth of experience, including with the development of the Australia's net zero plan, and she has she has fought a lot of battles, but she also has huge experience in dealing with things in the real world. Then I think I should move there. And we'll do this in two rounds. The first one focusing more on the international level and the importance of the multilateral system and the role of good governance in delivering on international commitments. And so we'll take that perspective first. And I wanted to turn first to you, Laura. Or do you say Laura? Laura. Okay.
But I answer to anything. Yeah.
Okay. And as we know, Client Earth has done quite a bit of work on climate framework laws. But what would make, and you've looked at, I understand, about 70 countries. What makes climate framework law strong? What brings real world outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think framework climate laws are really a critical part in closing that gap between the international commitment and ambition and that real world delivery and action. And at Client Earth, we've sort of we've supported governments with their framework climate laws, but we've also set out quite clearly what we think the key elements are of this sort of next generation of framework climate laws that we need. And essentially there are 6 main elements. First, and I'll go through them quite briefly, don't worry. First, targets, planning and institutional frameworks and architecture. So essentially, climate laws need to be legally binding and science-based with clear long-term and interim emissions reductions targets and really covering all of government institutions, all of the economy, and really providing that certainty. And they need, of course, to be supported by the right architecture, so the institutions, environmental and climate expert institutions that are independent of government and have that mandate to monitor government's progress and enhance public participation. Secondly, they, of course, need to be connected with financial and public policy, things like budget setting, procurement decisions, planning, permitting, really mainstreaming into all sorts of financial and governance decision making, requiring public entities to be sure that projects and other activities are really compliant with the emissions reductions goals of the Climate Act. And critically now, and as we are in this, very, very hot week, we are already living with the impacts of climate change. It's with us now. And so a key part also of framework climate laws is that consideration of adaptation. So mitigation is essential in terms of emissions reductions, but also clear provisions on adaptation. Really setting out, and considering an all-of-economy approach to adaptation, so considering things like water sanitation, food, infrastructure, cultural heritage, particular attention, of course, to vulnerable people. I spent a lot of time yesterday talking about pregnancy and extreme heat, for example. And countries all need to have national health adaptation plans, for example. So really thinking about how can we adapt to and be prepared for a warming climate. That's really critical. Then biodiversity and health interlinkages. You know, we can't just think about these things in silos. We have to be thinking about environmental protection, biodiversity protection, and really making sure that at the governmental level in that decision making, those linkages are properly considered. And so we're integrating climate and biodiversity targets and obligations. That's really critical, thinking about resource use. And then very important to be thinking very carefully about the health and climate links, and making sure that public health services are able to adapt to the changing climate as well, because of course we're seeing that health impacts of things like heat, but also increased diseases spreading. Finally, well, not quite finally, almost finally, participation and accountability. That's really critical, particularly at a time where we have this polarization, we have disinformation. It's really important that climate laws provide for transparency, access to information, public participation, and accountability. And so that means regular reports on government progress against climate change targets. And of course, today, the UK Climate Change Committee is publishing its report on progress. That's really important. And also ensuring that informed, effective participation of all stakeholders across society, civil society, including and then finally, really thinking about the guiding principles for climate action. You know, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. So it's really important that public decision making is always thinking about human rights obligations of states, you know, that right to a healthy environment, the rights of future generations. And climate laws should make sure that climate action is taken in a manner that's consistent with human rights obligations, and you know, with a just transition front and center. Hope it's a pretty whistle-stop summary. And then the other final thing I'd say, which is obviously, you know, preaching to the choir here, that it is shown that those countries that have climate laws, they do have greater success in reducing emissions. They do provide certainty for business, for all of the economy. And we know just here again in the UK net zero economy grew 10% last year, compared with something like, you know, 1 or 2% of the economy as a whole. So they are proven, and the IPCC has said very clearly they play a massive role in both mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a wonderful way of capturing this. And so it's both a question of scope, being comprehensive, but also depth in having a real world impact. Kath, if I turn to you, and the eyes are on Australia, of course, when a country puts its name forward as presiding over the climate process, what does the presidency this year, what opportunities does it provide for you and for Australia to accelerate global decarbonization?
Great.
It's a big question.
Yeah. So first and perhaps probably most important, I think that the co-presidency with Turkey for COP31 provides an opportunity to bolster the foundations of international climate action. And so really reinforcing the centrality and importance of the UNFCCC and of multilateralism more broadly. Like those things are not secure or stable or without challenges and headwinds. And so one of the key reasons Australia was keen to take up, we offered to host, and then we agreed the co-presidency arrangement is with that in mind. We consider the process of the UNFCCC to be one of the fundamental enablers of effective climate action. And, you know, like from a domestic perspective, one of the recurrent challenges to sustaining climate policy and climate action is the claim that we're acting alone, is the claim that No one else is doing anything, and so what we're doing is just incurring costs for no benefit. It's futile. Why would we bother? And the UNFCCC and the work that it has catalysed and supports is central to our response to those claims, to say we're not acting alone,
Exactly.
we're not Robinson Crusoe. And we've made serious progress. Like, you know, it is a really hard process, but we've agreed a rule book. The work is far from done. There's still a huge amount of implementation work to do, but the reinforcement of the FCCC and multilateralism more broadly is really central to sustaining confidence in collective action. The Australia and Turkey collaboration makes, I think, any outcome from the COP more compelling. The fact that it's been delivered through this innovative new way of collaborating. We'll need lots of different new ways of collaborating if we are to get to net zero. And so I think the mere fact of it is helpful. But kind of turning to the more practical aspects of as president, so a big part of Australia's focus is scaling up practical partnerships that deliver real progress in the real world, although I kind of always wonder, well, what's the fake world? Like, you've only got one. So, and this is particularly important in the energy transition. Australia is really keen to work with other countries to accelerate electrification, accelerate grid deployment, scale up energy storage and clean energy investment. It means that we need to be helping countries mobilise and access climate finance and improve investment to grow modern low emission industries. It's worth noting that the electrification goal, which the Turkey president announced as a big theme for the action agenda, will help deliver on the COP28 goals to triple renewables, double efficiency, and transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. And at the same time, it's going to help enhance energy security and reduce the cost of living pressures that are coming from excessive exposure to really volatile and spiking fossil fuel markets. Final point I'd make is that the presidency gives us an opportunity to really put the urgency and necessity of climate action back in the spotlight. And this is particularly important through our partnership with the Pacific. Australia, when it was bidding for hosting, was doing so in partnership with the Pacific, and we've brought that into the collaboration with Turkey. And that means that we can help ensure that the Pacific's priorities, particularly to keep 1.5 degrees within reach, remain front and centre of all of the discussions. And so we're supporting Fiji and Tuvalu to deliver a pre-COP and a special leaders visit, which will really demonstrate firsthand to key participants in the process the impacts of climate change on small island developing states, where climate really is not just a hot weather, wear your hat, it's an existential threat.
Thank you. No, I found this very encouraging perspective that you're bringing, and also thanks for highlighting, in a sense, the beauty of co-presidency and the opportunities that the co-presidency presents, which is a unique thing. Sometimes beautiful things come out of compromise, if done well. Let's turn to you now, Ali Mohammed. It's very clear to everyone how central sufficient climate finance is, and here we're looking at governance. And how would you how can stronger governance at the national level help attract climate finance? Does it help, and how?
Well, thank you very much. Let me first of all start by appreciating E3G and all of you here for hosting us. As Gina was saying earlier, I think it is the commitment of all of us who are here taking forward the whole issue of climate when it is now being pushed down by others. So we thank you all, and the collaborative work that all institutions and individuals who are in this place and other places will continue to help address this challenge. On matters of climate finance, of course, as we all know, climate finance is really the centerpiece of all the deliberations and the negotiations on climate change. I was, as you presented, privileged to be the chair of the African group of negotiators during the negotiations in Baku when we were discussing the moving from the 100 billion of Copenhagen to the 300 billion that we agreed under the NCQG. So it's really a very important issue for us to achieve if we are going to realize the ambitions and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So climate finance continues to, I think, evade us. We're not sure whether all the financing that has been undertaken or committed to is available. But there is, of course, a lot of positive things. So we have to appreciate what is happening. There's so much interest and support that's coming from both public and private, and as governments from the global south and particularly Africa. What we're doing is making sure that we first of all look at what is available at the national level. My president hosted a very successful Africa Forward Summit a few weeks back, where we brought together the African leadership together with the France leadership, and we discussed the whole issue of Africa's progress and Africa's growth at a time when there's so much protectionism and inward looking. And the emphasis that African leaders continue to push currently from the Africa Climate Summit in 2023 to now is, yes, as we continue to push for support and climate finance from elsewhere, there is opportunity for us to contribute ourselves. You will know that the savings that are available from African institutions alone, from World Bank reports and other reports, $4.3 trillion is available in African institutions. And if we are able to tap that, then we'll be able to, pool other resources. So, and I don't want to really belabor the whole issue of climate finance as a problem. It is the one that continues to create difficulties in the negotiations, but there are opportunities for us to make progress. And as we go to COP31, the message that we'll take there as Africa and as Kenya in particular, we are members of a number of coalitions that is trying to look at possibilities of raising finance from innovative ways. We are chairing currently a Solidarity Levies group that's looking at possibilities of raising additional finance from levies outside the public sector, from the shipping sector. We are pushing the whole agenda of NZF that's being discussed here in London. We are pushing the possibility of premium flyers levies and so forth. So national level resource mobilization is important for global financing to flow. So I think we need to twist the whole discussion of climate finance instead of finger pointing. It is important that we see how we can work together collaboratively to raise finance, and that is precisely what the African leadership led by my president is currently doing.
Yes, and if I could just connect what you were saying to this question of the real world versus, because we're moving from theory to practice on this, and you're speaking for Kenya, and you now are at 90% renewables in your power, and so part of it is also that leadership of making it happen, and to lead the way that way. And climate finance, even though it has been challenging, it's also an essential part of the global approach to dealing with this issue. Thank you very much for highlighting this. And let's now move to the national level. So we'll take a second round, focusing now more on concrete things at the national level. And if I turn to you first, Laura, I mean, you're dealing with different ecosystems, of course, and you're trying to look at how laws can create system change. But we heard earlier about fragmentation and the difficulties. But what role do the legal frameworks then play in tough times?
I mean, I think the most important thing is there is no one-size-fits-all approach, right? And so Client Earth works globally. We work in very different ways in different geographies. And so, for example, in Asia, where we're working very closely in Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, importing fossil fuel importing countries, they are seized by the urgency of the renewable transition. And so we're providing that legal, technical expertise needed for the regulatory reform needed for that transition. In China, where where there's a very clear imperative, we've been supporting the development of public interest environmental litigation. We've supported the environmental code. So it's really sort of working out where there's government will and ambition, we engage there with our expertise to support that. In Europe, of course, we have this polarization. We have some, the sort of wonderful named simplification, which is, essentially rollback. So we've been working there to really try and shore up civic space, the rule of law, access to environmental justice. So we won a case recently around comitology, which sounds boring, but it's essentially about how environmental decisions are made behind closed doors and the transparency of that. So that's really, really critical. And also looking with social media and AI at disinformation, because if we don't have information integrity and public don't have access to information, that's really challenging. So we're looking, for example, at the roles that social media companies play in amplifying climate disinformation and how we can hold them to account. Big tech accountability is a massive theme right now, and that's before I even get onto the environmental impact of data centers, which is probably another conversation. In the US, we are very much engaged on, we don't do anything around sort of governments. We're very much focused on the financial and corporate sector. Yeah. So really using corporate and financial law strategies. So looking at things like retirement funds and how they're invested, how they shouldn't be invested in fossil fuels. We have a really exciting class action against big oil for evading its asset retirement obligations. There are 2.1 million unplugged oil and gas wells across the US leaking methane into the environment because big oil essentially they sell their oil well or the gas well to a shell company before the end of its life. That shell company goes bust, and then they never pay to plug the oil or gas well and make it safe. So there's a massive systemic bankruptcy and fraud issue going on there. And then finally, that talked about class action there. We're really, and I think in these times of polarization, we have to really do all we can to center people in all this work, both in terms of the impacts on them, in terms of human health, human rights, but also people driving the change. Because of course, it's not political to want to, breathe clean air, drink clean water, live in a stable climate. And so, doing much more on the human health, human rights impacts of the environmental crisis, community-based litigation, really making this public interest environmental action mainstream, and supporting things like energy communities, because really we need to be pushing for corporate accountability, government action, but also driving that bottom-up change that you can get from community action in driving those solutions and holding the powerful to account.
Thank you very much. Kath, if I turn to you now, you've outlined how Australia aspires to contribute to the rest of the world, but if we look at this within Australia, could this help you to build up an inflection point in terms of your moving away from your dependence on fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, I think that particularly in the context of the current global energy crisis, Australia's certainly been affected by that, and it's flowing through in terms of our public discussion and markets. But before I get to what Australia's doing, I'd note that the impacts of the energy crisis have been much greater in our region and in developing countries and in our Pacific neighbours than it has in Australia specifically, and that where there's really important work to be done in working with our region to tackle that the kind of impact of the energy crisis on the energy transition. And there's a lot of work very focused on the immediate task of shoring up energy supplies, but what it's also doing and what we're seeing is that it's really re-energizing the work that we've been doing for some time, but which outside of a crisis lulls, and then with a crisis comes back to do the hard work of planning and policy reform and regulatory reform and skills development necessary to actually turn the aspiration for an energy transition into reality. looking within Australia, the transition away from fossil fuels was already well underway in Australia before the current crisis. For example, within our electricity systems, coal used to account for about 20 years ago, accounted for about 80% of generation, fell to 60% about 10 years ago, and it's now down closer to 40% of national electricity generation, just in the last 20 years. 20 years ago is about when we first started the climate and energy policies to start pushing more clean energy into the system. On the flip side, renewables have gone gangbusters, and so renewable share was less than 10% 20 years ago. That's now approaching 40%. It's about double the share of gas in Australia's electricity markets, and it's approaching the point where, and as Gina noted this morning, America already is, where renewables will very soon eclipse coal as the largest source of electricity generation in Australia's markets. And so we've got some good progress to report, but we're lagging far behind the leaders on transport decarbonisation, and particularly electrification. And we're largely dependent, we've got big coal and gas reserves, but we're largely dependent on imports for liquid fuels. And so we have seen a very acute kind of price spike in our liquid fuel markets. And in response, we're seeing a consumer-led inflection point in the transition away from fossil fuels. And so last year, battery electric vehicles accounted for less than 9% of new car sales. As I said, we were way behind the leaders, but that's jumped up to 20% in the last couple of months, just for battery electric vehicles. When you expand the set to plug-in hybrids and general hybrids, that's getting close to half of new car sales. And that's really fast from essentially a standing start just 3 years ago to now this real shift. And it remains to be seen whether that's a spike or a shift, but it's very encouraging. And that's been supported by policies. Australia was very late to the Fuel Efficiency Standard Party for vehicles. We only just implemented them a couple of years ago, but the work that was done for that and the capabilities that created and the focus it created in energy, in vehicle suppliers to the Australian market meant we were much better placed to respond to the current crisis than we otherwise would have been. I think from a policy perspective, there's a really clear opportunity in a crisis to highlight the synergies between what you do on the clean energy transition and what you would want on energy security. Our chair of the Climate Change Authority takes every opportunity to highlight that the things you do for decarbonisation also serve to bolster our energy security. And he loves the line, sunlight doesn't get stranded in the Strait of Hormuz. I love that line as well. It's just like, the renewable energy resources that we have as a country are not vulnerable to global supply chains in the way that fossil fuel supply is. And so the expanding renewables, improving efficiency, electrification, all of those things will reduce our exposure to volatile fossil fuel markets and boost our resilience to the inevitable future fuel crises. That said, we do have vast reserves of coal and gas, and so those energy security arguments don't really resonate in the context of electricity generation. And so that's where the kind of, or even just like, getting off coal and gas, we've got plenty, but that's where the trade lens is really useful. And so it's not just what we do in Australia, it's how we work with our trade partners. And that's because our trade partner, even though we don't need to worry about energy security for coal and gas, our trade partners sure as hell do, and sure as hell are. And so, and we pride ourselves on being a reliable, stable supplier of energy and resources to our trade partners. And we want to maintain that position even as the world decarbonises. And so the task is to plan and deliver that transition together, to coordinate our efforts on changing what we trade, changing what gets made, where, and I mean, that stuff has real implications for national economies, for national identity. Like we're a coal exporter. Japan is a steel maker. decarbonisation implies shifts in what we supply to Japan, and whether we do some of the processing in Australia, they do some of the processing in Japan, how that works, that's a really complex task. It's something that we need to be working together on. And at the Climate Change Authority, one of the things we've done is just articulate that task in a concept note for what we call decarbonisation deals. Lots of countries are already working on these under different banners, but it's that kind of stepping out the arrangements in terms of the kind of along a supply chain, what do you need to firm up confidence in investment in new supply, clean supply? How can you build confidence that the demand for green fuels and green metals is real? And what's the enabling architecture that sits around that to make it possible? And so that's the kind of necessary ingredients to really be able to spur green industrial growth at scale.
That's a beautiful segue to the final question. It goes to you, Ali Mohammed. In terms of Kenya has been calling for greater international cooperation on energy, and you were influential in that in both in Belém and then in the Santa Marta process. What are the lessons that you bring to that as Kenya and how do you see the future on this?
Well, thank you very much for that question. You know, we are in London, which is sweltering, and I come from Kenya. And I believe because we work together when you are in UNFCCC, you know how hot parts of Kenya can be. So we really must appreciate the diversity of the globe when it comes to issues and impacts of climate change. I hear, of course, my fellow panelists saying the vulnerability of the Pacific Islands. But I think we are all very, very vulnerable, all of us in different ways. And it's important that we continue to work together and make sure that we address this existential threat for all of us. Well, Kenya, with regard to energy, we are lucky. From start, we had renewable energy. Of course, we had a good mix of renewable energy. Indeed, we have all the renewable energies. Geothermal is the biggest source of renewable energy because we have hydro, solar, and wind. We have the largest wind farm in the continent. But not just for Kenya, the reality is the total energy generation for the continent of Africa is so insignificant. We are 1.5 billion people, and currently, you know, how much population gets energy? 600 million of us don't have access to energy. 1 billion of us don't have access to clean cooking. And so one of the things that we discussed with the incoming presidencies of Turkey and Australia is to, first of all, prioritize issues of access in the energy for the continent, because that is very fundamental. As we talk about electrification, which is important, and of course, many sectors are already leapfrogging in terms of transport and mobility. You will all have heard what has happened in Ethiopia last year. They banned importation of ICE vehicles. We are also doing similar things in Kenya. We haven't banned, but we are giving a lot of incentives for EVs and so forth. And Hormuz was, can I call it, a blessing in disguise? And so there's a lot of transformation that is taking place in that respect. But importantly, of course, electrification is something that is going to happen organically, but we must prioritize the whole issue of ensuring access to electricity in the first place for the billions who don't have electricity. And that is what we are pushing as a continent. As Kenya, that is what my president, who is privileged to be chairing the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change, this is the messaging that we is trying to take, including last week's meeting at Avian on the G7. This is the message that we continue to prioritize. Let's make sure that the investments flows to the peoples and areas that is most needed. We all know the figures. How much money has been generated for energy investments. 2/3 of the $3.2 or $3.3 trillion of energy investments last year and the year before were renewable energies. And that is great news for the world. But the amount that is flowing to the continent that is most needy is just 2%, or even sometimes slightly less than 2%. So these are the things that we need to correct, the inequities in the whole process. And we continue to push that, and we hope that with the support of all yourselves, we'll be able to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so that concludes the panel. And I mean, this whole issue of energy access, it just gets your heart boiling in a sense. And the fact that while we're building all the data centers so we can here in the north entertain ourselves while people don't have electricity for their basic needs is just appalling. So thank you very much for this panel, and we move on.
Thank you, Helder, and thank you to our panelists for that discussion. We're going to move to our next panel, and I'm really pleased to invite Dumisani Nuxmalo, my colleague, the co-chair of the International Climate Council's Network, and from the Presidential Commission on Climate Change in South Africa. Dumisani, I'll hand over to you and let you invite the panelists up.
Thank you very much, Carla, and good morning to all of you. I see some movements, so we are really gearing up to take it to the ground and really hear some of the key voices around how we continue to enhance the governance question. Sorry, I was just trying to get mic'd up there, but I think we'll manage with the roving mics from the technical team. So we're now going to move to our panel, next panel, really, which will focus on the governance question, particularly with a very strong social dimension. And there we're going to welcome on stage Emma Pinchbeck, who will really give us some very exciting energy context, but also Emma is really the Chief Executive Officer responsible for the UK's Climate Change Committee, and she's also the key National Climate Advisor who has served quite extensively in the energy sector and has a wealth of experience really around the renewables energy space, but she's also been very close to the coal phase-out process, and we look forward to hearing from her around the governance question from a UK perspective, and particularly the energy sector. And up next, we're going to welcome Malini Mkhra, who's the CEO of the GLOBE Legislators, the people who give us and empower us with the climate laws to be able to continuously take the conversation forward from a governance point of view. Malini has really been close to the legislative process, having currently serving as the CEO of GLOBE Legislators, which is an organization founded by LCAW and John Kenny. She's the award-winning leader, or at least winning sustainability leader, and has very extensive experience from at least 4 decades of engagement, advisory, and advising quite senior leaders, including the UN Secretary General and the Mayor of London. So she'll have a lot to say about what conversations they had with the former mayor or the current mayor around the climate issues in London. So moving on, then we're going to have Karen Silverwood-Cope, who will join us. She's the climate director at the WRI Brazil. She's also very close to the conversations around governance from the Brazilian side. Karen currently serves as the civil society representative in the mitigation working group of Brazil's Interministerial Committee on Climate Change. But before joining then, she's been quite closely working on the in the presidency's office, especially on issues of environment. She's also worked closely with ministries of environment, science and technology, and the likes. We're going to hear from the colleagues now. Let me just transition to the seat quickly so we can ask them some quick questions. Yeah. No, that's fine. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with you, Emma. I mean, we've had the conversation flowing from Gina, who's really reminded us the importance of multilateralism, who's also reminded us the importance of continuity. And I think it is within the social fabric and the social, infrastructure, the soft infrastructure really, that we are able to secure that level of continuity, that we are able to secure the level of multilateralism that's needed to respond to the climate question. And maybe the first question to you, Emma, is really around the media space. I mean, we continue to hear quite a lot of misinformation and disinformation about what is and what is not caused by climate change, what is not exacerbated by climate change. But to you, really, it's around the negative media that would lead people to think that climate-friendly policies don't have public support. And wanting to know from yourself, how true is this? And how is the UKCC navigating this new media reality and landscape around this question?
Oh, yeah. Oh, this is working. Is it working? Good. All right. Yeah, fix social media. That's it's a big question. So from the Climate Change Committee's point of view, when we're thinking about the media, we have to do it as an independent public body. So we're the Secretariat of the Climate Change Committee, we're all public servants. It's slightly different from the British civil service in that we are allowed to be rude about the government, but we can't be specific about policy that isn't climate policy. So we have a bit more freedom. But it is really important that we're seen as politically neutral. And so much of the conversation has become politically polarized that can be a real challenge to be in that space. So things we've learned from doing that, and we do a lot of media at the CCC. Firstly, facts do really matter to people. So I do, in an era of short attention spans, I think there is a tendency to try and dumb down messages and try to engage on emotion rather than fact. Now, if you're in a social media environment, you do have to have quite a punchy emotional message, otherwise the algorithm will ignore you. But what we find when we speak to the public and turn up with charts, which we tend to do, there is a real desire for that. So on Monday, I went to an event south of the river with one of the UK's big energy companies, Octopus Energy, and they'd invited their customer base, 7.9 million customers in this country, to come to an event talking about electrification and cheap electricity and energy market design. They had 300,000 members of the public register for that event. And I did it last year, and I did it against some really kind of very famous speakers, Stephen Fry, the actor. So they had people like that. And then I turned up with 5 charts on electrification and talked them through them. And we got the best feedback from the audience last year. And so they had us back again. And I regularly do big podcasts, some of which you'll heard of, like The Rest is Politics. And again, when I ask for the feedback they get from the audience, it's it's so nice to have data and charts and facts and also nuance in an age where people are yelling at each other. So I think for climate councils in particular, where we often have a lot of charts and facts, you can lean into that space. The other thing is so that you do have to find a way to make it have meaning and cut through. And if I'm allowed a slightly rabble-rousing point in London Climate Action Week, we're putting a carbon budget, we're not, the government are putting the carbon budget through the House of Commons this afternoon. They've taken the Climate Change Committee's advice on that. It means that the UK, by the end of the week, will almost certainly have a new target for 87% emissions reduction between the years 2038 and 2042 in the law. Thank you. Thank you. Just But the point I would make is, having done several of the carbon budgets and as part of the climate movement, there's no noise around it like I would normally expect to see. And as a consequence, there have been some motions of regret registered in the Lords, which are largely inaccurate and nonsense, because a lot of the Green members of the House of Lords didn't know the debate was happening, weren't there, didn't have the messages. Those of you who look shocked by this, me too, but I think it's the era we're in where we're a bit divided and distracted, and we haven't worked out how to do social media campaigning, and we need to, otherwise in future years we might not get a carbon budget going through the House of Commons, and that, I think that's not a me job. I am now a well-behaved public servant, but it is definitely a you job. So I'll bring you the facts. Could you bring some strong opinions, and could you do some mobilizing? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's indeed quite exciting. Indeed, we do need the buy-in from the communities as well, which will really ensure that even the processing at legislative level remains as relevant as possible. And really, we do want to also enhance, as far as possible, the voices from communities, making sure that everyone feel heard, everyone is heard in the process. And for that, we want to hear from you, Karen. Given Brazil's size in terms of population, being quite diverse also from a cultural perspective, but also from an ethnical perspective, how can a country like Brazil achieve enough consensus, around a complex question such as the climate and the push forward towards decarbonization?
Thank you. Thank you, E3G and ICCN, for having Deborah here. It's great to be with all of you here in this discussion. And being a political scientist, I couldn't be more excited to be following this discussion from this morning. And I think the beauty of governance is turning diversity into legitimacy, right? But good governance, it's only good as its roots. And if you look across contemporary democracies, you can see that good governance is also all about architecture and process design. And a process design that is well tied in into executive, legislative, and judiciary branches. And that's where we have to build all those linkages and these connection points between civil society, communities, policymakers, all together to make it work. Now, Brazil is a good laboratory case. We had this very inspirational opening by Gina this morning, and I was just thinking through, God, how much we can talk so much about across America geographies. And in fact, all that is happening in Latin America and the right conservative backlash that we are seeing in the continent, South continent, North continent, and across many other geographies. Now, in Brazil, we started our story on climate governance back in 2007, a while ago. In this meantime, we saw it being built, we saw it being dismantled by a conservative right government from 19 to 2022, and we are now watching it all being rebuilt. So it's a story of cycle. That's why I go back to my initial sentence. Governance is only good when it's rooted. So I think this very fragile state of democracies or governance in democracies are really something that we have to question, assess, and understand. So what we could see from Brazil's laboratory case is that if you want to have a good governance, in fact, you have to have agile creation mechanisms that are proof of concept of connecting people, but also bringing the emerging problems right up, surfacing what is the problem around mitigation, adaptation across the board to different roles and branches of government. What I think is very interesting in contrasting with the UK Climate Change Committee is that you have it stated by law. So it's your 2008 Act that puts us up and running. But if you in fact look to Latin America, in most of democracies, it's normally stated by a decree, which is basically a cabinet decision by the president of the executive branch. Now, how do we make it rooted and really connected into the lawmaking process of the legislative? And how do we actually bring citizens in an accessible manner to the judiciary? And a very interesting phenomenon is happening and very well assessed by political science, which is the judicialization of environmental decisions. So since we've experienced this moment of extreme right presidency during 2019 and 2022, citizens and youth organizations were able to file suit against the executive for paralyzing climate change policy. And that was quite an innovation. And I think, as we had in the previous panel, this very interesting point of having, yes, judiciary is a key player for climate change. And I think we have to connect that better to citizens and to organizations. That's still one of the weakest bridges that we could have in that sense. And again, governance is about pushing ambition in climate, but having durability. And that's, I think, also another question that we need to discuss and think further how that could work across geographies. In Brazil now, we are in a very good moment, right? We had COP30, we presided G20 in 2024, we're gonna win the World Cup now, as you all know, of course. So it's all about Brazil. We have 25 sectoral climate change. We have our national climate plan. Our climate fund has never been so filled with money. So things are thriving in Brazil at the moment. But we have elections coming in October. Guess what? Our governance still lying in a decree by the president. So I think history moves, but the cycles are, spinning around. And we just want to move story pushing forward into a more stable and durable architecture in Brazil.
Thrilling. Thank you very much. Indeed, that's quite exciting. I mean, we've heard from a government perspective, and we're hearing a little bit of snippets about the power that the judiciary holds. But we want to hear more about what the legislators can do, particularly noting that climate policy affects our everyday lives, from the things we buy, from how we move, from what we trade. We've now come to realize the impact of climate change across the value chains. And I wanted to turn to you, Malini, to really check from your network's perspective, commanding members of parliament from around the world, how do you, as members, successfully bring, the diversity of the voices of the citizens and their concerns, whilst also pushing for ambitious climate policies in your legislative jurisdictions?
Certainly, thank you very much. And thank you, first of all, to E3G and to ICCN for also bringing us to the coolest chamber in London. My husband is an engineer and two of my children are engineers, so it's wonderful to be in one of London's oldest institutional centres for engineering. It's Mech-Eng, it's not Chemical Eng, but I just want to recognise the history of the space that we're in, because when we're talking about the climate transition, the energy transition, it's not just the policy has been very important, but the people who have made it happen, many of them have been engineers and technicians. So all due credit where it begins. I would like to, for those of you who are not familiar with GLOBE legislators, we were indeed, as has been mentioned, founded by not just Al Gore, but co-founded by Al Gore and John Kerry, and a group of prominent parliamentarians from other parliaments around the world. So Russia, very interesting. Our member at the time, Vladimir Vorontsov, was the only independent member. He was a physicist. He was the only independent member in Russia's history, also during Soviet times, of an independent parliamentarian. Everybody else was a party member. We had Akiko Domoto, who was a legend in Japanese politics. She was our founder. We had founders from the European Parliament. So this was an international effort to bring together legislators, because in 1991, when we were founded, we're celebrating 35 years now, there was no international platform for parliamentarians to engage on the burning agendas which were just beginning to reach this decade of summitry that began with the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And so Gore, Kerry et al. Came together and created this platform called GLOBE. And GLOBE was there to harness the power of legislators, but importantly, to have legislators respond to what was already then acknowledged as a climate crisis. They were there at the birth of the UNFCCC. And they were the ones, and GLOBE legislators were the ones who came together and created the architecture of climate change legislation that we see now. So I've been doing this for a very long time, and I just want to acknowledge that my first COP was COP3. Wow. We're at COP31. Anyone remember? I know there are two people in the audience who will remember what COP3 is, so don't give it away. But what was COP3? Where was it? This is pretty shocking. It's Kyoto, 1997. Kyoto was the first moment where we agreed on emissions reductions. That should be part of our history as environmentally literate people, as professionals. Not taking anyone to task there, but I just want to call out Alden Meyer, who was there with us, and Kirsty Hamilton, who was there with us. I was with Friends of the Earth International, Kirsty was with Greenpeace, and Alden was with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So you see, there is a link to the science councils that we're talking about today. At that time in 1997, we had around 52 pieces of legislation or policy that could be considered as climate change related, climate change, energy, forests, etc. Now you know that we have an excess of 3,000. So GLOBE and organizations such as GLOBE have been at the center of that, global legislators, including our member from South Africa. I just want to highlight the role of the Honorable Cedric Froelich from the Parliament of South Africa. South Africa has just adopted its own framework climate legislation 2 years ago, sir. So there is a lot of movement which has happened, but of course parliamentarians have been at the center of that. But what we're discussing today is the relationship between parliamentarians, other parts of the executive and the judiciary, but also how they engage and mobilize and create support and trust in the citizenry. So just picking up on something that Emma has said. So one of the reasons that why we promote the UK's Climate Change Act of 2008 was twofold. Number one, because it came through a cross-party process, and GLOBE is a cross-party organization. So I would never enter into a GLOBE forum and assume that I was only talking to left-wing parliamentarians. I would always want to assume that there are others across the political spectrum who would be there. So this is the mistake that we have made over the last several years, where we have assumed that climate change is a left-wing agenda. Because when Gore, Kerry et al. came together in the 1980s, it was very much bipartisan. That bipartisan continued through the 90s, through the 2000s, such that when we adopted the 2008 Act and when we adopted the 2019 net zero commitments, it was through a conservative government. And in fact, the president of GLOBE for a very long time used to be John Cummer. John Gummer, Lord Deben, who was the chair of the Climate Change Committee for many, many years. So that was the first aspect. The second important aspect is that the Climate Change Committee reports to Parliament. So Parliament is its first audience. So you have that debate in Parliament. And when we're talking about promoting the Climate Change Committee as a model around the world, we do find that there are parliaments who don't accept that. Not parliaments, but the executive who don't accept that. Because they don't want it to go straight to Parliament and have that debate, have that democratic engagement, because parliaments should be sovereign. And so they keep it to themselves, and it becomes an imperfect, it's not able to deliver in the way that the Climate Change Council experience in the UK committee has delivered for us. The second point relates to something very important that Karen said, and that was the connection with the judiciary. So in 2015, so I've been CEO since the end of 2014, and the first thing that we did in 2015 in preparing for the Paris Agreement, so this was COP21, I think everyone's familiar with COP21. So what we did then is we connected with senior jurists, members of the Supreme Court of a number of key countries. And the person who was the leader in this process was Brazilian. He was Antonio Benjamin, Justice in the Brazilian Supreme Courts, the man who created the Forest Code. So Antonio and I cooked up this program where we brought the legislators, and we continue to do this on a regular basis. We bring legislators and the judiciary together, Supreme Court jurists, to try and understand, first of all, at that moment, it was 2015, we didn't have the INDCs, we didn't have the NDCs, we didn't know in which direction climate change legislation was going to go. But what we wanted to make sure was that when courts address these issues, when, for example, Client Earth pushes for courts to address grievances and courts come out with decisions, that those decisions come back to the legislator. And parliamentarians debate, what is this telling us about the efficacy of the laws that we have created? What do we need to change? Where does post-legislative scrutiny come in? So this is a process that we began in Paris. We continued in Rio. We had a meeting in Brasilia, but importantly, it was the Rio de Janeiro High Court where we had that discussion with Marina Silva, with many others. And most recently, well, it's not recently, it's now 8 years ago, but in 2019, when we started London Climate Action Week, we had that discussion in the UK Supreme Court. So this is something which has continued, and most recently, 2 weeks ago, I was in the Vatican where we were having that same discussion. What are judges telling us from the outcomes of their verdicts that lawmakers need to be attentive to? So I wanted to point out that this is a landscape which is incredibly fluid, but my final point is, and that touches on this judiciary, on this, the citizenship engagement aspect, is that parliaments around the world and political cultures around the world are incredibly diverse. Some political cultures, this will be my final point, are embracing of citizens coming, not just citizens, residents coming to them and having surgeries, coming to surgeries. The UK is absolutely unique in that, okay? You can go and meet with your member of parliament on a Friday and you do not have to be a UK citizen. You can be a resident. So the distance between the parliamentarian and the citizen or the resident is very small, right? This makes all the difference in the world, because in many parts of the world, you cannot, because they are up on a hill. So there is a social status, a social distance between the citizen and the political leader, the parliamentarian. And it is the best parliamentarians who shortcut that distance. And there are lots of examples, but I've gone way over my time, so I hope that that's going to be saved for my second round. But thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you very much. Yeah, no, that was quite insightful and really quite interesting. Thank you for the COP3 reminder. I had read about it somewhere. Now I was cracking my head trying to think where what that was. And thank you very much for pointing out the chair, or at least the former chair of South Africa's portfolio in Parliament of Environment, who really led us very well in the years 2018, 2019, when we were consulting on South Africa's Climate Change Act. And we are happy now that we have the Climate Change Act in place. In fact, it also establishes PCC now formally as an independent entity, and we are currently finalizing the regulations in that regard. So thank you very much for joining us on the session. The Climate Change Act has, amongst others, really helped us to dilute a lot of the misinformation. As you correctly say, some thought that PCC is established by forces from the West or from the global North. And the Act really puts that into perspective, that actually it was the social partners from labor, from business, from community, from youth that met in 2018 through a presidential job summit framework agreement and agreed that the PCC ought to be established. The climate mandate ought to be elevated to the level of the president for it to be as effective as it needs to be, because it sort of interfaces across the different ministries. But to bring that more into a specific set of examples, allow me to move back to you, Karen. You were recently elected in the mitigation working group, and obviously part of that then speaks to, bringing the representation from a civil society point of view. And what I wanted to just understand is, what is your role specifically in the working group, and how do you plan to use, or at least what are the initiatives from the Brazilian government that are seeking to enhance the voices of the citizen from a climate policy perspective?
Thank you. So as I said, once we started rebuilding climate policy and governance in Brazil back in 2023 now, we came up with a very wide and comprehensive approach to governance, and now it's very inclusive in a multi-level governance model of civil society representation, state and municipal level, which is our federal system, right, representation, and also horizontal representation from ministries. Brazil has around 40 ministries, and we have most of them, I think around 30 of them, engaged in our governance system. So what happens now, whether you're discussing mitigation or adaptation, is that you in fact can connect with different sectoral ministries, state-level government or municipal-level government, and discuss striking issues for mitigation or adaptation. And that's been up and running since 2024. And key aspects of our national policy have been brought into the discussion. So as never before, Brazil is now in a very important moment of having open and comprehensive debates across different participants of all the key matters that will bring the country to achieve its NDC by 2035 and to build its pathway to the net zero goal by 2050. So, and I think that's not only about the climate policy, but all that is happening in Brazil, if you also consider the regulation of the carbon markets, which WRI Brazil is also the technical organization that is also representing civil society within the regulation of the carbon markets. Sustainable taxonomy, also another issue in the frontiers of the finance ministry. They are normally more isolated if you compare to environment ministries. Also, there are civil societies discussing actively sustainable taxonomy, how you can come with an incremental approach to have that up and running for the financial system. So I would say that from market regulation, financial regulation to climate policy goal, it's now all open to discussion in Brazil. And we are so thrilled about the moment, but also so worried that, as I said, it's all based in thin ice of a presidential decree. So it's really about waiting for October, our election period, and really hoping for a good outcome in which we would be able to maintain and sustain that point, because of course Brazil is one of the top 10 emitters in the world, and sustaining climate policy, which is also so fragile in the face of the risk of having conservative governments, that we have to make important movement. And it's not so only in the executive, but I would say working closely with the legislative. So mitigation policies being discussed actively in the executive working groups for mitigation, but the federal mitigation ambition has to be established by the legislative. And we haven't accomplished that yet. So there's more to do, there's more to come. And I think that's what much lying ahead of most of civil society organizations and those that are supporting ambitious climate change action in Brazil.
Thank you very much for that. Indeed, it's quite a journey to set up climate laws, I can tell you now. Having seen through the 2011 National Climate Change Response Policy of South Africa and waiting for that to be converted into law all the way up to 2024. So it has taken a couple of administrations to see that through, but it has also taken the resilience of the citizens to be able to, take that forward. And I want to move to you, Emma. Looking at the citizens panel that you carried out in 2022 to explore the question of what an accessible and affordable vision of net zero would be for households. How was that panel conducted and what were its findings? Maybe we could learn some lessons for resilience to take to Brazil.
Oh, every time I think this isn't going to work. So I think a couple of things, and to touch upon something others have said about the UK's Climate Change Act, and then to talk about the citizens panels. So the UK Climate Change Act is a fairly extraordinary bit of legislation that we're all very proud of and kind of want to put our arms around and defend. And the cross-party nature of it also matters, as well as the fact that it is a constant in very changing times. But what it also does is give us quite clear direction as a secretariat about what our job is. And we do the same thing over and over again, regardless of the government in power. So we've been doing carbon budgets every 5 years. And I think I'm on my 7th Prime Minister now since Brexit. So the value, and I came to this job from the private sector, and the value of the carbon budgets is we're required to look 12 years ahead of time. So we're rooted in a current context that will define the debate around the carbon budget in the House today, but also all the work that we do. But we are fundamentally trying to rise above the current environment and give advice which is independent, politically neutral, and 12 years ahead. But every time we do advice to government or do our progress report, we can innovate a bit. And one of the things we did in the last cycle is introduce more direct citizens panels to test trade-offs And trade-offs are really important in climate work, because I think sometimes we pretend they don't exist. So we have tried to sell climate change as the land of milk and honey if we just kind of go through the transition. But we all know for policymakers that they're often stuck between doing something for decarbonisation, or a particular question of trade, or a particular question around energy policy or energy access. And those things often come good in the end, but in the political moment they're in, there is often a very real trade-off. So, and I can see B, who runs our people and business team. You should catch her in the break, by the way, and ask her all about citizens panels, because she ran them with her team. But we take a group of citizens, demographically diverse, politically diverse, so we make sure that they have voted for, across the group, all different political parties. And we ask them over around 8 weeks worth of deliberative sessions about, for example, who should pay for the transition, or does this increase in cost for your summer holiday flight or your energy bill, is that acceptable to you? What level is acceptable? Should we put these costs onto taxation with these consequences for the public? Should we put them onto the cost of gas? Like, what are the trade-offs there in trying to get at what they find acceptable? And then we write that up and give it to policymakers. Now, we're a bunch of unelected bureaucrats, so we don't tend to come down on one side or the other on a question of policy, but what it means is we can qualitatively show politicians, firstly, evidence directly from the public. Secondly, we model any distributed economic impact, so which groups then do better or worse once the public have made a decision. And that means that they can take that into consideration along with the broad economic analysis that we offer. So some favourite things from the citizens panel, two of which I think are generic, and one I think is particularly British, that I'm proud of in an era where we don't often get to brag as Brits anymore. So the first thing that comes back absolutely consistently: the public understand that climate change is happening. Across all voter groups, the right and the left, you'd have to be an idiot not to look at it out there. So they absolutely understand it's happening. Interestingly, they are starting to come to us a bit more frequently questioning whether it's man-made, something that I anecdotally attribute entirely to social media and suspect the data will bear me out over time. But there is this vacuum for them getting good climate science that we take care of in the first session of meeting with them. The second thing that is consistent, and this is to the land of milk and honey point, is they are worried about cost, and upfront capital cost in particular, and they expect government to help them with it. So it is, I come from the renewable sector, absolutely true that renewables are the cheapest form of power. That doesn't change the fact you do have to build them and invest in them. And it's a very difficult economic environment all around the world at the moment, but particularly in Western democracies where we've been carrying public debt. So that is a question. We've got to do something about upfront capital costs. We've got to help people get these technologies. And the third thing, which I think is particularly British, but also borne out in lots of different social research, is that people want the vulnerable to be protected, not just from climate change impacts, but also from carrying the cost of the transition. And then just to think about that for a moment, what that means when you're engaging with politicians who have concerns, particularly on the right, but also on the left, about what the transition means. You cannot dismiss them. You have to engage with the critique. It is not unreasonable to say, will this put energy bills up over the next 5 years, and is that a problem? You have to have an answer to that question. So a lot of what we then do is in our analysis is we try and think about some of those questions when we are then doing our modelling and trying to give answers to politicians. So to give you an example, we are very interested in the rollout of electric vehicles, whether that's going to a second-hand market, who's buying them, whether that then is being borne out by the messages we're getting from our automotive sector that they're finding it difficult to sell them and they're worried about the industry. Like, what's going on there? How can we explain that to politicians? And then that feeds into the recommendations we make, which largely are about tackling those concerns. So the primary recommendation from the Climate Change Committee for the last 5 years has not been legislate the carbon budgets or like prioritize emissions reduction. It has been make electricity cheap. Why? Because electricity is responsible for about 60% of emissions reduction from now to 2040. And if it's not cheap and people can't get like good, cheap energy from the transition, they will not continue to support net zero regardless of the fact that they theoretically do. So I think that's how we talk to the public and kind of use what they say to us. It's been really useful, and we'd love to do more of it. I can also see Professor Becky Willis, who's an expert in this kind of thing, sitting in the audience. You should definitely get her. Yeah. And then I know I'm well over time here, but I also, the point that was made about the connection of politicians and the public, that is true, but even in the UK, politicians hear from their constituents who are in an information environment where they are not always getting good information, and we see that when we then talk to them. So quite often, it's not necessarily a lack of engagement. Sometimes it's the worries that the public are hearing about in the traditional media or on social media or somewhere else about the cost of the transition, about the cost of net zero, about the role of this country versus other big economies, about whether or not people are doing this, that then reaches politicians and drives their behaviour. So just a plug for the work of climate councils. We also provide a useful service to politicians who hear worries from the public and giving them the facts that they need to have those conversations. And I think that's why having someone very presciently in 2008 thought, I bet climate change gets politicised, we should probably have an independent body of experts to advise politicians about climate change. And that's what we do. So it's as much about supporting legislators, as well as challenging them, I think, and that is at the heart of what good climate councils can do.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And
also, can I just do one more cheeky punt for South Africa?
Sure.
We should also say that we're, sitting here bragging about the work that we do with citizens, but I think some of the other international climate councils who you will have heard from, particularly those who are very concerned about questions of just transition and social justice, have embedded work with the public into their model and have done that from scratch. And that is something that we are, as the oldest climate change committee, sort of building into the way we do our work, but it's not quite hasn't been our core identity. And the work that South Africa did in particular to bring citizens in when you were designing your climate legislation is something that we have looked at and, been inspired by and stolen. So I think the Global South in particular is good at this. And although I'm pleased to be here and talking about the CC Act, I think in terms of engaging citizens, it's not always the Global North that is as good at that as other countries can be.
Yeah. Definitely. Indeed, the South African model was quite interesting, particularly also for bringing together the NDC, which we've recently committed, especially from a procedural justice point of view. But as parting shots, Malini, just quickly, your organization has been carrying out pioneering student MP climate surgeries for quite some time now. Do you want to just give us some two bullets about it in terms of the sessions and what you are trying to achieve there as a way of closing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm just going to make two sets of points. The first is quickly to respond on this issue of climate councils and citizen engagement, because I think it's very important to recognize that there is real pedigree and lineage in this. So the important thing about climate council, about citizen assembly processes, is that you can get people and it can, you can design it really well. But if the decision makers to whom it is addressed do not pick up on the recommendations, it leads to cynicism and defeatism. And this is what we have seen time and again. So I want to just bring you 20, 30 years before, because we have been doing deliberative democracy experiments for a very long time. And I'm going to give you two very quick examples, which kind of counterintuitive. In the mid-2000s, I was in government, in the UK, and we worked with an American academic called Lawrence, I want to say Fishburne, but I'm sure that's not right because I think that's the actor. But it is Lawrence. I think he's from Princeton. I can see my mind's eye. But what he did was really interesting. He was working in China at the time, in the mid-2000s, and they were running these deliberative dialogues across the Chinese provinces. Now, you may not know, but China has a national assembly, a national council of 3,000 members. It is one of the world's largest parliaments. You could fit all of the members of parliament in the world in Wembley Stadium, and it would still not be half full. 3,000 of those are Chinese. So when we look at the Chinese model, we have to remember a story which is never told. This is part of the problem of the media narrative, that what informed the Chinese decision makers, and I led for China in DEFRA, so I know this firsthand, was that they were listening to what people were saying. And so Lawrence's deliberative democracy, his engagement efforts, which would never have been cast as democratic engagement in a democracy, actually had the desired effect, which was that the Chinese leadership listened. The other leadership, this is at a subnational level, that listened, was in Texas. They did the same thing to try and understand from the people in Texas what kind of energy model were they looking for. Well, they went for the model, the wind energy model, where they could actually pocket some of the benefits. And this is what led to that. Second really quick point is about affordability. I mention this because it always comes last. And it's such an important point. Yesterday, Globe hosted the inaugural Nigeria Climate Investment Summit. We had a whole afternoon of the country's leading lawmakers, leading policymakers, leading investments, talking about how they were going to decarbonize the country, how they were completely pitch ready, there was a new energy regime in place, and everybody forgot until the last session to mention the word affordability. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly come to your question about what we're doing that's different with Globe. So in 2019, when we started London Climate Action Week, Globe actually hosted the very first event at LCAW at the UK Parliament. And we brought young people directly into that dialogue. This was 2019, remember, and it was right after the climate strikes had become rooted across Europe. And we saw young people marching to their parliaments on Fridays. This is the UK. What happens in London on a Friday, if you're a member of Parliament? Where are you? You are not in London and you are not in Parliament. You are in your constituency. So when I saw this, and I'm Indian and I've grown up with a strong understanding of civics and politics, and I know what my government does and who does what. And it was apparent to me that actually there was a real breakdown in understanding. We hadn't done our job in basic civic and political education. So young people thought that they would be meeting members of Parliament on a Friday. So that's why we started the climate surgeries, and we held them on a Friday. We said, this is Fridays for a future, but please, this is also part of your political education. You know how many, I don't know how many Londoners there are here? How many Londoners are here in the audience? Okay, a smattering. Can you guess how many London MPs there are? No one knows this. There are 75 members of Parliament in London. And a large number of them, Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn, Ed Davey, are in the cabinet or leaders of the opposition or significant members of Parliament. So what we do with these surgeries is we reach out to each of these 75 members of Parliament, and that's 1 in 8 of the 650 members of Parliament across the country. And we say, spend time with your young people. It can be in a school, they can come to your surgery, but for whether it's 1 hour, half, an afternoon in the day, but this is your moment to talk about climate change, how it affects you in your constituency, what you're doing about it, listen to your students' concerns and recommendations. So that is a surgery. On Friday morning in Brent East, Barry Gardner will be hosting a surgery in his primary school with Cedric, Honourable Cedric Froelich from the Parliament of South Africa, and with my president-to-be, Sam Onoigbo, the Honourable Sam Onoigbo, from the Parliament of Nigeria. So they will both be going to experience, because we have now rolled this out across the world. It's been held in Nigeria, it's been held in Senegal, and it's a fantastic way of bridging that gap, that intergenerational gap, that knowledge gap, that climate literacy gap. So come join them if you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time is always the enemy, and it is the enemy of climate progress as well. Thank you very much to our fire panel, and we hand back to Carla. I think it's for the break, tea break. Okay. Back to you. Thank you very much. If we can give a round of applause to our panel.
Some people off in roundtables. Special announcement with Mary Robinson and Luke Bass. So welcome. Thanks, Jean.
Great. Thank you, Carla, and thank you to E3G and ICCN. But before we start, I just want to take a pause and say just a massive thanks to every one of you in this room, because many of you have dedicated your work, your life to this work. And these climate councils are probably more important than ever before any other moment in history. So I just wanted to open by saying a massive thank you for your time, your dedication, for everything you're doing out there in the world right now. And we're excited to be with you today because we're hoping that what the Planetary Guardians are about to launch is going to help elevate the work that you're doing. And the Planetary Guardians, they're an incredible collective of leaders who are really elevating the planetary boundaries science that Johan Rockström and a group of global scientists have put together. And they're really focused on how do we make this a measurement and operating framework that governments can adapt to their own nation. And we have a few Planetary Guardians in the room, so I just want to call them out. We have Gie Bastida here in the front row. Woohoo! We have Paul Pullman in the second row there. I think we have Ralph Chammy and Naoko coming in as well, and we have the amazing Mary Robinson, who I'll introduce in a second. And at last year's Planetary Health Check, if anyone saw that, you would have seen that 7 out of the 9 boundaries have been breached. So that's 3/4 of our life support system. So there is absolutely no denying the urgency of this moment right now. And what else is really, really clear is that we are never going to be able to do this alone. Collaboration, and collaboration at a scale that we cannot even begin to imagine, is going to be absolutely critical. And of course, that's global collaboration, but even more importantly, national collaboration down to a local level. That's where a lot of the action is going to happen. And that's why, again, we're so excited to be with you today. And each nation has different challenges that you're facing. For some nations, it's about security. For other nations, it's about heat and pollution that's harming their citizens. For other nations, it's more existential. It may be about flooding that's going to potentially destroy where they live. But all nations have something in common, that this is also probably one of the biggest opportunities of our lifetime, one of the biggest moments to create new ideas, how we uplift our economies, how we keep our citizens healthy as we go back to a safe operating space. And the only way we're going to be able to take up those opportunities as well as manage the risks is if we think on a whole planet approach. And again, that's why we're so excited to be with you here today. And all of you already embed what you do in the science. And now governments have an opportunity to think about how do they look at that whole planet approach? How do they connect finance, security, health? And when we were thinking about this, how we use this planetary boundaries framework as a guide, as a compass, Mary Robinson, ever as brilliant as she always is, came up with a brilliant idea. And I'm going to let her share that in a moment. I'm going to ask her to come up to the stage. And as she comes up, you all know who she is. The other 2 days ago, Andrew Steer described her as a global treasure. And I'm going to shift that slightly and call her a planetary treasure because she is someone who works harder than any human being I've ever met in my life to serve people and planet. I think for every single one of us who have had the privilege to hear her, to listen to her, she is probably the biggest beacon for moral courage and servant leadership in the world right now. So Mary Robinson, come on up.
Well, thank you, Jean, for that very kind introduction. You know, we wouldn't have Planetary Guardians without a certain Jean Ollowang. But I, first of all, want to personally thank the International Climate Councils Network and E3G, because this is the perfect forum for the initiative that I'm going to have the honor to announce, the absolutely perfect forum, science-based, good governance-based really understanding the issues. And it was an honour to be chosen among these wonderful planetary guardians who you've also heard introduced, because the planetary science is acute and a bit frightening. And what we're trying to do as guardians is say, yes, we're in a very difficult and even, fragile and worrying situation when you look at the planetary boundaries, but it's all political. All we have to do is have the political will, shift the money, etc. And that's for the planetary guardians where we come in. And we did have, as a practical way of drawing attention to and restoring the 9 planetary boundaries, we came up with the idea of a network of chief planetary scientists. And the chief planetary scientist would be an advisor who can work not just with environment ministers, but with finance, with security, with development, with health, and harmonize and influence policies to take a whole planetary Earth approach, with the planetary boundaries as a guiding framework. Unfortunately, I think we have to say the voice of science to many governments is still too quiet and very siloed. There are very few examples where heads of state and cabinet are fully advised on the implications of the breaching of these 9 planetary boundaries. Do they know the connections between these planetary boundaries? Have they understood the science? I'm afraid all too often the answer is no, they have not. And yet they need to be developing policies at the level of seriousness that this issue demands for national security. And, as a former president myself, I know the value of good governance. So this network, as Jean has emphasized, is not designed to replicate or to replace existing climate councils or chief scientists. In fact, in many cases, we think these roles could be elevated to greater cross-ministry importance. And every country is different, and each country will tailor and should tailor the idea to their circumstances to make sense in their own governance structure and system. Sometimes we're working with countries to establish the first scientific advisors. In other countries, it's a very complex environment, and we're looking at how to strengthen the voice of existing leaders, existing councils and panels. We want to form a global network showing the power of good governance, but also to share solutions, risk registers, and information, as almost all of the global risks and tipping points have planetary boundary breaches. They span national borders. In the United Kingdom, for example, the Joint Intelligence Committee report showed a staggering vulnerability from climate change due to high reliance on imported food from extremely climate-vulnerable countries. First, impacting inflation, and then the availability of that food. We've already seen coffee prices go up by 1/3 in the last 2 years because of lessening yields due to extreme heat. That's not a problem confined to the United Kingdom. That's a problem in my own country, Ireland. And it's a problem in a number of European countries, very dependent on that globalization that we went for in a very big way. We need more local food production, more food sovereignty in these countries. It's therefore critical for food importers to be working with scientists in exporter countries to fully understand and collaborate to minimize these impacts and to support vulnerable nations who haven't caused the problem, but they have been hit hardest by it. That's the climate justice issue. This is only one example of planetary boundary risk transcending national borders and the jurisdiction of one ministry within a government. Others, such as pollution, such as extreme heat, and natural disasters, are the greatest security risks of our time, and more importantly, the greatest responsibility of our time to minimize suffering. And that's why this community will be a great network across countries to share knowledge, best practices, and deliver. So a network begins with one pioneering individual, and I have great pleasure now in welcoming and announcing our very first member of this network, Luc Baas, who has been appointed by the Belgian Federal Climate Minister. And in full demonstration of what I said earlier, not one size fits all, it shows that tailoring to national governance frameworks, he will be appointed as a chief planetary officer. And we're very happy with that. We know that in different countries it will be done in a different way, but the point is to get this network, to get this sharing of knowledge. To hear now from the pioneer, Chief Planetary Officer. Luc, please come up. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Obviously very excited, also with some pride as well, because to pioneer is always with some pride, but also with some risks, of course. But as we are a risk assessment center, we do our best in even assessing this risk of taking up this role. And of course, a network, it has to become. And if it wouldn't, but we will do everything we can to help create a network and talk to colleagues in government and in the specific centers like ours, which is an independent governmental center in the Belgian government. I had to get that network up and running, and that some members this year will join. But yes, if nobody takes the first step, then you can keep on talking. And I think we've been talking a lot in many places and in many fora. But there is also something that I have to admit. It's also a nice coincidence with the actual mandate of our center. So it's a climate risk assessment center. The abbreviation comes even from how the name was before, Climate and Environment Risk Assessment Center. But then climate seems to be ringing better because you have climate governance, climate this, climate that, but it's way beyond climate, of course. Climate is often even only showing underlying environmental weakness, vulnerability, and making the problem visible, but climate is not always a problem for everything and anything. So for example, in Belgium, you will be surprised to hear, but we are a very water-stressed country. If you look at the list, we're very up, I think in the Western Europe, we are high up, and then people, what? And if you've been to Belgium, you know it's wet as England, not as wet as Ireland, I think, but it's wet. But we don't keep the water, and we overconsume, and we mismanage it, and therefore we have a water-stressed situation. And then when there's a long drought, with climate change, it becomes visible. Only then we realize. So climate change is often just showing what is underlying at this very moment. Unfortunately, and with all the predictions we see, we have to prepare for worse. It's better to be prepared. This is also what we do as a climate risk assessment center. So as with everything, as preparing or being strong in a threat for a war, to start preparing, and you can have a long discussion, are we doing the right thing? Should we invest all these billions and what and so forth? But we do. We prepare for that risk, but we're not preparing enough for what is becoming more and more inevitable, which is difficult to say because we're doing all these mitigation efforts and we have to continue, we have to accelerate, we have to do more. And luckily, at least, we see that the worst case by the IPCC has been ruled out now, which is the hopeful message, but the lower one is also ruled out now. I mean, or it's better to prepare. So what we do is prepare for, in fact, for 3 degrees. It's also what France has been doing. So that's on the climate front. So in the mandate of our center, it's literally in a royal decree written that we have to assess the risks from climate change and by extension, other transgression of planetary boundaries. And it's in a formal government document. No, that means that we're assessing the risk, we're advising, we're trying to bring the solutions to the table. We're doing no fundamental research. We're 13 people in this center. We are very much dependent on collaboration. And we do it already across ministries. So many of the boxes we're already ticking of what you're hoping for, not all of them. We have a very extensive program with the Federal Planning Bureau in Belgium, which is the economic authority, to assess the cost-benefit analysis of, or to do the cost-benefit analysis of adaptation. And we're doing it with them. It's not us doing it. And there's more examples of that, and I don't want to necessarily go too far with that. Of course, Another thing that I think, drawn attention to, and in the presentation, when Jean saw my presentation and she spotted, okay, there is a downscaling of these planetary boundaries done in Belgium. Other countries have done this. We've seen it from New Zealand. And maybe if there is going to slides pop up, I can actually show you what it looked like for Belgium. No, there's a lot of things to push and pull here. I think this maybe. Oh yeah, look at that. That answer, unfortunately, is very clear. Yeah? It's not. We are definitely not. And there is a consumption and a production part to that. And you see that that there is climate, biodiversity, water, health, and economy are connected, but that in the assessment, the only one where we felt more secure, but it's because of the planetary boundary approach, is water. And now you see that sometimes you need to have some honesty also on how the framework works, or it may not work. So honestly, here we see a positive result for water, but as we dig deeper, and this is a bit funny to say because we actually have to dig deeper for water in Belgium more and more, we see that it's actually a problem, but it's because some of the elements were not included in the framework that we used. So neither framework is perfect. But then again, the perfect is the enemy of the good. You need a framework. And for us, the planetary boundary framework is a good framework to also define consumption, production, keep them apart. And for Belgium, as a very trade-dependent country, 80% of our GDP is trade-related. These kind of links with the planetary context are obviously super critical. The role in Belgium is, as I said, it's advising, it's giving guidance. We don't have a mandate to change the whole system. We don't have a mandate to tell the departments what to do, but we hope to inspire them. That's what we do as a climate risk assessment center. We have assessed in our Belgian climate risk assessment that was published in November. We were the first to add, and okay, it's step by step, ecosystem degradation risk. So even if climate change wouldn't be happening, the ecosystem degradation and what it means for society has been much less studied. We had a lot of models we could follow from Australia, from Ireland, from a very good assessment in Ireland as well. And of course, from the European Climate Risk Assessment, ours was, and I see colleagues from the European Environment Agency or from the Secretariat, who are in the agency in Copenhagen, the Secretariat of the European Climate Council. We were able to use the model, and then we had to adapt it also to the Belgian context. But we added 5 ecosystem degradation risks. And we were struggling in how to see what that actually means economically, societally. We were talking about biodiversity impact, loss impact of health, but it's not being systematically studied. And I hope that maybe this group and maybe exchange with the others will start doing that. So we are very positive about this. We hope that there will be a fast growing network. There will be specificities in every country, as Mary already said, in Belgium, and I think in most of the EU, honestly. Maybe I can ask a question now. Who is not from the UK in the room? Okay. And who is then from Europe? Okay, do you have any chief scientists in your countries apart from Ireland? Because that's part of the Anglo-Saxon world, I think. So scientists, it's not something that is being used in the country. So we decided for this to be a chief planetary officer. It's a consequence of my role as a director of the center, but we want to push, of course, the boundaries on this. And understanding all these links across all these planetary boundaries. And just to wrap up, to make you understand how for us the social impact and the security impact are also key. Because we are, and again in our mandate, we have a mandate to advise our National Security Council. That's another thing where the climate and security world is looking at us. How are you going to do that? How are you going to convince the security actors in Belgium and by extension in Europe to act? And that's a evolution that's happening. The climate adaptation plan in Europe is not called climate adaptation plan anymore. It's a climate resilience framework now, where preparedness for what's coming is pivotal. And so that's another narrative, a new way of approaching things. There's many and much more information that goes before this, but here you can see the whole cascading into what ultimately was defined by our own state security actors as their biggest worry for national security. You have supply chain issues, you have food price issues from abroad, but internal social disruption because of unfair impact on the vulnerable people. This is what is being accepted as a really big risk, and I'm sure it's similar for all the countries in Europe. And this is, of course, maybe even a bit of a Western approach, I have to admit. The security issues in other countries will maybe of a different character, because without climate change or impact, there is already a lot of much more inequality. But even here, we had a bad potato season. Prices went up 30%, and it did impact people, because there's still, believe it or not, there's still 200,000 people dependent on food support in Belgium. So even a wealthy country has these kind of challenges still, and a lot of inequality, and we take this very much at heart. And then ultimately here, I think it's going to be too long to explain this to you, but what we ultimately want to say is that even in this great framework of the planetary boundary approach, we have to be careful that we do not silo within itself. And so we have been looking specifically with our universities in Belgium to make these links and look, okay, with pollution and heat, of course, there's a few obvious ones. There's some that are less obvious that are connected. And I think that ultimately for us would be the biggest added value of this network, that we can understand, of course, how we use this planetary framework, a planetary boundary framework in our guidance to our governments, but also understand what are the interlinkages and understand that better. And with this, I'd like to close, and thanks for the invitation to kick this off. Thanks to Mary for your leadership, and to the other planetary guardians and everyone involved, and keep spreading the news so appetite will rise in your constituencies. And I think it's a common effort. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Luc, for explaining the approach you've been adopting and building up in Belgium, and how valuable the planetary boundary framework is. And I loved the links you made with security. We need that link much more now, because this is a security issue in a very, very real way. And I come back again to the forum where we're launching this. It is really great that we've been able to do it in the Climate Governance Forum, to unveil the Chief Planetary Scientist concept, our first Chief Planetary Officer, and celebrate Luc and Belgium being the first country to adopt the concept. But more countries will be announced before COP31, but there are active negotiations going on with a number of countries. And so, you know, I know, because they've come up and said hello to me, there's Irish presence here that I hope will kind of think about this quite actively, but also, you know, other councils. I do think we need a framework of advice to governments, but also, interestingly, we feel the principles of elevating science and de-siloing policy intervention are, you know, a nexus that's not just appropriate to governments, it's appropriate at sub-government level. It's appropriate within countries with regions and regional level, but also to business. You know, there are applications of the chief planetary boundaries to right across the board, but it really is a step forward for us in our planning, that we now have this network launched, that we have our pioneer, and a very good pioneer at that, Luc, and that we will have more announcements before COP31. So please spread the word. You know, this is something to think about. We need to elevate the science, because I'm learning science is being undermined. The IPCC is having, you know, financial concerns at the moment, and we need to fight back on behalf of the science, and no better forum than this forum to help us do that. Thank you very much indeed.
Mary?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the Planetary Guardians, and we promised some innovation and also how can we elevate climate governance and governance writ large for the environment. We're now going to move into a conversation on innovation for future generations, and I'm really pleased that we are working with International IDEA. Delighted to welcome Michele Paletto, who is going to bring up in fact, we're going to bring up the whole panel and just jump straight into the conversation, and Michele will introduce you as we go.
Thank you very much, Carla. Can you hear me? Yes. What a pleasure to follow President Robinson, and what an honor being here with you all today. My name is Michele Poletto. I work as advisor for climate change and democracy with International IDEA, an organization focusing on promoting and protecting democracy worldwide. And among our programs, we also look at the connection between democratic governance and climate change. We are convinced that climate change is among the greatest challenges that our governance systems face, and our political system will be measured and will be judged on their ability to tackle climate change in the long run. However, we cannot help notice for future generations. I think you can have access to it through the QR code, which looks at those potential reforms, innovations in the core architecture of democracies to better respond, better represent the interest of future generations, and better respond to their needs, including, obviously, effective climate action. So I'm extremely pleased to discuss about these topics today with our panel. We have Xie Bastida, a climate justice activist and storyteller from Mexico, also executive director of Re-Earth Initiative, a global youth-led organization making the climate movement more accessible and intersectional. Alina Averchenkova, distinguished policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment of the London School of Economics and Political Science, and one of the co-authors of our report. And Dr. Chang-Hoon Lee, co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Climate Crisis Response of the Republic of Korea, and distinguished visiting professor at the Graduate School of Environmental Studies, Seoul National University. So, Xie, let me start with you, if I may. So, you have been, so talking about future generation and young generations, you have been deeply involved in youth climate organizing and youth movements, from Friday for Future to co-founding Re-Earth Initiative. From those experiences, how do you say this debate about the representation, the acknowledgement of the interest and needs of young and future generations, and what does meaningful participation look like and feel like for you?
Thank you very much. Before I start talking about future generations, I just want to acknowledge once again that today's a historic day for the Chief Planetary Officer / scientist launching, because we have been dreaming of this day as the planetary guardians for a long time. So can we just give another big round of applause for this historic moment? And I'll start by saying that future generations is a really interesting concept because for me, I come from an indigenous community in central Mexico, and most of you who have worked with indigenous communities know that the operating framework is a 7-generation thinking. So thinking of the past 7 generations wisdom for the future 7 generations stability. And I always like to bring this example about how right now in the planet, there's around 7 to 8 generations alive at the same time. So you could see, for example, myself, my mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, a future daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter. So at any point, we could actually weave the 7 generations through us, and we forget about this. We forget that the 7-generation principle is alive every single day, and every single person we meet, we are having an opportunity to be thinking long-term. And as we know, the current political economic system is so short-term lived, and there's so much pressure for people to get reelected, or the quarterly reports of income, or all of these things, that when you are thinking of the stability of future 7 generations, no one can assure you that the future 7 generations will be okay. Yesterday, I was speaking at the UNEP Finance Forum with all of these economists and bankers, and I asked them, can any of you tell me that it's worth it to invest in my retirement? Like in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years, is it worth it to invest in my retirement if we don't know what the future is going to look like? Will asset managers be able to have that security? There's so much risk. Things are becoming uninsurable. And so these are very real ramifications that you cannot assure not my generation, but the 3 next generations, that their future will be anything like our present. And when those things are so real and become so tangible, how are we not including youth in spaces to challenge the norm that we have today? How are we not having representatives of future generations to say, but are you thinking about resource depletion? Are you thinking about the debt burden that so many nations, especially in the global south, are feeling from all of these loans that are marked as climate finance, but in reality, they're just making our countries accumulate debt. And so I've been in the climate space for a long time. My parents met in the Earth Summit in 1992, and I love saying that because they were thinking about their future generations, right? Before I was born, they were already thinking about how they would make my life better. And for me, any investment in my future is being a climate activist. Like, and I feel like all of us can sit into that. Any meaningful investment in my future is that I'm speaking up every day, that I'm speaking up in every scenario, in every situation. And being in the youth movement has been incredible because it's shown me that my peers care as well. And we are the closest, as one of the other planetary guardians, Aisha Siddiqa, often says, like, youth are the closest to future generations. But for me, a grandmother who's from an indigenous community could represent future generations just as well. Any of us can be spokespeople for 7 generations, because the important question is, what type of ancestors do we want to be? And when we can really internalize that, then we are defending those who will come after us. And this report is, I mean, I was just looking at it now, and it's amazing the way in which it's framed, how we can represent those future generations in different political spaces. But it's also the attitudes that we have every day. So I think the challenge that I have for people is really think about what it's like to have somebody younger and somebody older next to you in the decisions that you make, especially when they're big, important decisions. The planet cannot handle our way of being anymore, and we have to think about serving those who will come after us. And I think, bringing it back to the planetary boundaries, I think that future generations should have the right to be growing up within planetary boundaries. If we can make that happen, I think we're already on the other side.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, as you mentioned, we are looking into potential proposal solutions, innovations for to have more effective institutions to deal with these topics. And Alina, let me turn to you now. So in the report, we discuss this short-term bias, so the tendency to give in short-term pressures, incentives, interests, and to neglect those topics like many environmental issues whose costs and benefits become fully apparent only in the long run. And we looked at those possible innovations to change this in some key sets of institutions, democratic institutions. So constitutions first, parliaments, parliamentary reform, and then dedicated institutions for climate change, for instance. And in particular, you look at this category of institutions. So I wanted to ask you, what is your take on the potential of this independent, dedicated, sometimes independent, dedicated institution for climate change, and what can be done to maximize their impact?
Thank you, Michele. And I think I'd like to build on what she ended on to represent interests of future generations, we don't necessarily need someone from the future. Any of us can do that credibly, given the right tools and the right perspective. And so in our chapter, we consider innovations that we're seeing around the world, where dedicated institutions are being created to precisely look after that future interest and to bring this long-term perspective into policymaking. And so the different types of institutions that we identified are commissioners for the future. For example, the Welsh example is probably the best known in this space, but we are also looking at other countries where similar commissions are being established. There are also models where there is indigenous commissions. For example, we cover the case of Cameroon in the Kingdom of Mbesa, where indigenous commission for the future is being created and is now reaching out to other kingdoms as well, using traditional forms of governance rather than working with the formal governance system, and they're actually reaching some really interesting results in terms of engaging communities in some work, integrating this long-term perspective. What we find is that different models, most of them actually operate within soft systems of governance. So most commissions or dedicated advisory bodies on the future, that's a different type of institution. They don't have hard enforcement powers. There have been a couple of examples where in Hungary and in Israel, such commissions did have enforcement powers, but most of them use convening, advice, coordination with the government and other stakeholders to inspire and to induce change and to bring that long-term thinking. Nevertheless, we see that they can lead to tangible outcomes. And one of the most cited examples in terms of reported outcomes is the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations Commissioner. So they are now in their 10th year. And the success of the commissioner to a large extent is attributed to strong legal backing. So it's backed by the legislation, and also by approach that draws on a wide range of different well-being goals. So they have 7 well-being goals which speak to different policy agendas and integrate this long-term thinking across. And I think that's very much in line with this thinking about planetary boundaries that Mary and colleagues have presented today with this new initiative. And they also work across different levels of governance, so not just at the national level, but down to the community level. And what we've seen in particular with the Welsh Commission, for example, they've been able to overturn some policy decisions and investment decisions which would be clearly against sustainable development goals. For example, 1.4 billion investment in motorway extension. They've also been able to integrate and change the transport plan for Wales, integrating sustainability concerns. And some of the interviewees that we spoke to as part of this project talked that they actually integrated future into DNA of Welsh policymaking, which is a very powerful outcome. But there are some challenges, and one of those is, how to get them political powers and how to get them integrated into the highest level political conversations. Finance and capacity is a challenge, similar to many independent advisory bodies on climate change. Most of these innovative institutions are under-resourced. And there is this tension between power and democratic legitimacy. The 2 examples I mentioned of Hungary and Israel, where commissions actually had more enforcement power, that backfired eventually, and they have been discontinued because there was political opposition. So it's a delicate balance between this enforcement power. And in the report, we also provide some recommendations on how these institutions can be made more effective and more impactful. And the first one is actually having that legal backing. I think that's very much in line with what was discussed in the previous panel on climate institutions. Having them integrated into legislation gives them much more legal and political standing. What is also important that they backed up by cross-party political consensus. And again, the Welsh example, the underlying legislation was developed for a broad consultation and participation with involvement of citizens, and that helps bring political resilience, which is crucial. And finally, on the framing, I think if all of the events so far I've been to at this London Climate Action Week, we talk about narratives and how we're failing to get citizens to buy in into ambitious climate action and the danger of backlash. With our analysis, what we found is that talking about future generations or intergenerational equity doesn't resonate with people. Most experts that we discussed this topic with say actually asking someone, what do you want as a future for your children and your grandchildren, delivers much more powerful and useful conversation than using this quite distant concepts. And in Cameroon, for example, they highlighted that using culturally embedded concepts like king being the guardian of the seeds of the future, that is something that resonates with communities. So I just wanted to end up on that note that as we think about designing and advocating for these institutions, we should very much think also about the language and how we actually approach this issue. And I think the way you've told your story and the generational connection, I think that's an extremely powerful way of doing that.
Thank you, and thank you for the important and interesting research that you brought into this publication. So, Dr. Lee, let me turn to you. So, in the same line, talking about dedicated institutions for climate change, from your own experience in the Republic of Korea, what role can Climate Council play in supporting governments to take a long-term approach to climate policy planning?
Thank you for having me talk about our experience at this meeting. I think one of the most effective ways for Climate Council to support long-term climate planning is to ensure that its members serve terms that extend beyond electoral cycles. For example, the UK's Climate Change Committee is a good example. However, many climate councils around the world, include Korea's, do not have that institutional advantage. Even so, I believe climate councils can still maintain a long-term perspective in three important ways from our experience. First, through independent and diverse governance. In Korea, our commission brings together 29 non-government members alongside ministers from 22 government ministries. These non-government members come from science, industry, labor union, and small business, academia, and civil society. They do not represent partisan political interests. Instead, they represent community sectors whose futures depend on long-term climate resilience and competitiveness. Their participation helps ensure that climate policy discussions remain focused on long-term national interests rather than political consideration. Second, through legally established long-term goals. Government may change, but climate objectives such as carbon neutrality and international commitment under the Paris Agreement provide continuity. A climate council can act as an though not a planetary guardian, but as an institutional guardian of this commitment, ensuring that policy decisions remain aligned with the long-term national goals. The third way is through meaningful citizen participation. This is one of our session or another people's sessions. This May, we launched Korea's Climate Citizens Assembly, a permanent deliberative body composed of 200 citizens. We intentionally strengthened the representation of younger generations because they will live longest with the consequences of today's decisions. The Assembly's recommendations are formally submitted to our Commission and relevant ministries are required to provide an official response within 3 months. This creates efficacy and creates a direct institutional link between citizens and policymaking, while helping ensure that climate policy reflects long-term societal interests rather than priorities a single electoral cycle. Of course, governance reforms such as longer terms for climate council members would further strengthen institutional independence. We are actively discussing such improvement in Korea, but our experience suggests the long-term climate governance ultimately depends not only on the length of appointment, but also on strong institutions, broad societal participation, and a shared commitment to future generations. That is, in my view, as where climate councils can make their most valuable contribution.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. We just have a few minutes left, but I still have time to perhaps get back to you, Xie, with another question about your experience. You have already alluded in the beginning to your history of activism. You have also spoken about the fact that your commitment is rooted in your indigenous background and your experience as well of climate impacts in Mexico and the United States. How have those experiences shaped the way you think about responsibility to future generations, and what should governments and policymakers learn from that?
Well, what you're alluding to is that in my community in central Mexico, Tultepec, we live near one of the largest industrial corridors in the country, which actually I had no idea. For me, it was normal that going to school, everything would be polluted and the river would smell horrible. And that was just kind of like how life was. But my community actually has a natural protected area because of my community's work, my parents' work to make our lagoon, our wetland protected. So it was always kind of like going back home was beautiful, incredible. We could see the ducks flying and the water flowing. But as soon as we stepped out, everything was gray. With this pollution and all of this environment, then when I was 13 years old, my hometown flooded. And the worst part wasn't the water, it was the overflowing pollution of the river. That's where the actual health impacts come for our crops, for ourselves. And that was a life-changing moment for me because my parents had been talking about climate change and all of these things. And I was like, that's in the North Pole, far away from us, far away in the future. And a lot of youth, especially in schools, that's how we're taught, maybe not anymore, but 10 years ago, that's how we were taught about climate. Something far away that didn't impact you. But when it did impact me, when it came to my doorstep, that's when everything changed for me. And I realized that we couldn't wait any longer. And I forget which IPCC report it was, but it shows the amount of days that future generations are going to be living under extreme heat. And I think right now we are in some of the hottest Junes that London has ever seen, if I'm not mistaken. Like there's people who live here who've told me, yesterday I was talking to an 11-year-old and he told me, I've never felt this before in my life. And so the kids are aware that this is not normal, even with their short memories. London, always people complain about how it's gloomy and wet and rainy, and now it's anything but that, right? So I know that future generations are going to experience way more heat in their lives, but not just heat, disasters in their lives than any of you have, than any of us have. And I think that's unfair. That's the foundation of why we're doing this work, because it is not fair that the lives will be materially different when the infrastructure is not ready for those type of futures. And then the second thing I'll add is that in most constitutions, institutions, and the report talks about this, when we talk about future generations' rights, it's often also paired with rights of nature. because we understand, and I'm looking at Jojo here because Jojo has been doing a ton of work on the rights of nature. But it is understood that when you're thinking long term and you're thinking of the stability of future generations, it cannot exist without the stability of nature. And there's animals and wildlife out there that lives 500 years, 200 years. There's turtles, there's whales that live up to 200 years. And so what happens with the future generations of beings out there? Not just us. 7 generations of humans from start to finish is roughly 250 years. And there's animals that alone in one lifetime that can live that long. So this is really about pushing the boundaries of what society has normalized. It has normalized short-term everything. Thinking, gain, right now our attention economy, I think the average video on TikTok is watched for 7 seconds. That's that cannot be the world that we're building, where everything is just so fast. And my mom once told me the solution is really to slow down. And I told her, but every single invention that we have ever made as humans is to speed things up and make things more efficient. People are not going to want to slow down. But then she said, but the earth doesn't speed up. The earth lives within its cadence. A tree will take the time to grow that it needs. And so we need to go back to the cadence of the earth, to the cycles of the earth. And that's really the message. When you live with the cycles of the earth, you respect the cycles of the earth, and you can ensure that they keep on going for the next 250 years and beyond. My call for policymakers is that we're not only thinking about the future that we're bringing future generations, but also the generations that we're bringing to the world. Does that make sense? Like, we don't, and this is a very, very common indigenous phrase, we don't inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. What if we operated every single day with that in mind? What if we had every single board and every single advisory council with youth to represent future generations? Or to your point, maybe not even youth, but just future generation commissioners. I think this is the time where we need to ask ourselves and our communities to take this seriously. And we are speaking up. We are, as a young generation, we are taking this seriously. But many of my peers are still scared to have kids. Like, I think that's another thing that we need to name. My generation doesn't want to bring kids to the current state of the world. So we need to show them that we're fighting for the world to be safe for the potential kids that we might bring into this world. So I'll just wrap up then. I think it's really the time to change everything. And like my dad used to say, sometimes it's not about just the future innovation, but remembering, going to the past, remembering who we were and what we can bring from that for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Xi, again, for making this connection between the past, the present, and the future. And actually, our main message from this research, from this, the commitment with these initiatives, is that even though our governance systems, our governments are clearly accountable towards the present citizens, their voters, does not need to be a conflict, a contradiction between the interest of the current voters, current citizens, and the young and future generations. It's not a zero-sum game. Also, as we discussed today, when the people are informed and are questioned properly the interest of their children, grandchildren, these are topics that also people living today and voting today have at heart. So we have the duty to continue working on these issues and continue improving our institutions to be fairer and more representative of the interest of future generations. This said, thank you very much to our co-organizer, E3G, ICCN, for this opportunity. And I hope that this will be only the first opportunity to discuss on these topics and engage together. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Michele, and thanks to all the panel. We are going to bring everyone back in now, so there'll be another little movement. So just bear with us for one moment. Is that right, Ben? We're bringing everyone in now? Or are they coming in afterwards? We might get, Rick, we might get organised with you, and are you going to bring people? Yeah. Do you want to bring, are you bringing everyone up?
We're going to come up one at a time.
One at a time, okay.
Yeah.
I'll do a quick handover to you once everybody's in. Are you happy? So lovely to meet you. Yes, let's talk. Let's talk. Yeah. Are they coming in? While people are rejoining from the roundtables, and before we move into our final Climate Council dispatches with Rick Smith and colleagues, I'm just going to hand to my colleague Ben Rhodes, the head of the Secretariat for the International Climate Councils Network, to give you an update. Hey.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Carla. Wonderful to see so many of you here. It's an absolute pleasure to host again the Governance Forum with E3G and ICCN. And we've had delegates from all over the world, from Armenia to Zimbabwe and everywhere in between in the alphabet, which is wonderful to see. So we hope you enjoyed the sessions today. I'll keep my remarks brief, and we'll hand over to some of our climate councils to talk through some of their dispatches from around the world, but I just wanted to kind of give a bit of an overview of the ICCN. So I'm sure many of you know us quite well, but for those who don't, just starting with what we define as a climate council in terms of our membership. You will have heard it throughout the day, so I won't dwell on this too much, but they're all official expert advisors. So they have an official mandate from government, they have suitable expertise, often grounded in science, and they're advisors, but they're advisors plus. So you can see here all of the other ways that they help ensure strong climate governance, making sure that they support the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature in their roles. The network's grown. We now have 31 members from around the world. So you can see now across 6 continents all over the world. So we're really glad to see this growth, welcoming this year members from Lesotho and Colombia as well. We now cover 20% of global emissions through our membership, and we're really keen to grow that as much as possible. It's a member-led network, so the Secretariat is hosted by E3G, but it's independent and member-led. And our mission is really to strengthen climate governance through effective councils. We've just agreed a 3-year priority with our plenary, and these are 4 of the key priorities that we're delivering over the next 3 years. The first one is really branching out and having a regional team. So we have a headquarters here in the UK in London, but we now have roles in Chile to support the Latin America region, and in South Africa, supporting Africa. And next will be Asia Pacific. We're looking at lots of capability building, which takes a lot of different forms with all of our members. We're hoping to launch a governance curriculum, not just to support existing members, but actually all of those new countries who are seeking to strengthen their governance. So that's a new initiative that we're hoping to launch this year, as well as showcasing the impact, both in terms of communications, but also through the research of what works in what context. And today we're delighted to announce a launch of a Climate Council report library. So we've partnered with Climate Policy Radar, who many of you may know holds 35,000 climate policy documents from around the world. We're delighted that they've offered us our own curated library of Climate Council reports. These allow you to search and filter all of the recommendations from different councils from around the world, auto-translates to English, so it's powered by AI, with lots of search functionality and targets. So please do have a look at this library. You can see a QR code there. So yeah, do have a dive in. It's focused on those critical annual progress reports of government progress towards climate targets. So it's a really helpful resource to see what are the actual expert advisory councils recommending, not just what governments are implementing. I'll stop there and I'll hand back to Rick. I think if you want to come up and we'll take on the climate dispatches around the world. Rick, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ben. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much to E3G for its incredible partnership, not just at this event, but throughout the year. We formed, I think, quite a constructive, powerful partnership, and we really appreciate it. My name is Rick Smith. I'm the president of the Canadian Climate Institute, and it's also my pleasure to co-chair the International Climate Council's network with my great colleague Dumisani Numalo from the South African Presidential Commission. Welcome to this last session of the morning. Andre was joking that we're standing between you and lunch, so that's always an enviable slot in any program. But we did want to, in keeping with London Climate Week's theme of climate action, we did want to leave you with some last good news stories. Some dispatches, if you will, from the front lines of climate policy, demonstrating that progress isn't just possible, it's actually happening. And that climate councils, in particular, are in the thick of the action, whether that's in the UK, or any of the 31 jurisdictions where we have members around the world. I want to acknowledge at the outset, I was joking with somebody before this, that this morning is dedicated to I think, the most important, least sexy aspect of climate change discussion, climate change governance. And yet here you are, still, wrapped, leaning forward in your chairs, hungry for yet more stories of great climate change governance moments. But let's just acknowledge here at the outset that climate councils are not the flashiest of organizations. We're not terribly dramatic. Quite often, we're not the most newsworthy, though noteworthy that our UK colleagues are much in the press today, setting the agenda. And quite often, it's not our media quotes in the climate change universe that are the pithiest or the most incendiary. In fact, in our Canadian context, I had a recent taste of this. There's a recent Guardian article with a Canadian commentator who called our Canadian Climate Institute staid. Apparently we're staid. So I wasn't actually quite sure if I knew precisely what staid means. So I looked it up, and my dictionary says that the definition of staid is, quote, generally serious and unadventurous, often to the point of being boring. However, this is still the dictionary. However, unlike the word boring, staid carries a sense of dignified respectability. So I'll take that. I'll take dignified respectability. And the reason that I'm passionate about this work, and I'm passionate about the work that we do in our institute and with our growing international network, is if you think about it, climate councils were really created for this moment. In a volatile world, climate councils bring more predictability. And in a fragmented world, climate councils create more social solidarity. And in a world full of misinformation, climate councils are in the business of producing good evidence. And so this insight that led to the creation of the UK Climate Change Committee and the Australian Climate Change Authority and the South African Presidential Climate Commission and the other 28 members of our network is that the often overheated climate change discussion needs to be tethered to something approximating fact, and that creating a system, a structure that is baked into national and subnational decision-making helps to do just that. So as you just heard from Ben, the Climate Council model has spread very quickly across the world. It continues to spread. Our network has as one of its priorities capacity building, the assistance of the creation of councils in new subnational and national jurisdictions. And this model is spreading for one simple reason. Climate councils create better outcomes for the climate change discussion. We accelerate progress, and we see these results every day. Now, we don't win every battle, and we've recently had experience with this in Canada. And I'm sure my colleagues will have had similar recent experiences. There are many mornings when you wake up after the day before and your government did not take your advice, but you dust yourself off and you keep going because we're in the persistence business. We're in the tenacity business. We're in the momentum business. So for the next few minutes, we just wanted to leave you with a few stories of impact and tenacity from some of our incredible members who are doing this work every day around the world. And it's my task to start you off with a story from Canada. So here's one story, a recent story about impact. In 2022, the Canadian Climate Institute published a report called The Big Switch, Powering Canada's Net Zero Future. The report introduced a concept that in 2022 was brand new, and we had a hell of a time convincing Canadian media or decision makers that it was actually a thing, and that concept was called clean electricity. And the idea that we advanced in 2022 is the notion that producing electricity in a non-emitting way is not only good for the planet, it's actually good for the economy. In fact, it's an inbuilt Canadian advantage because we have so much potential existing and potential hydropower as one example. And also, if done right, clean electricity is more affordable for consumers. And so starting in 2022, we drove hard on this affordability analysis and tried to flesh this out in terms of our analytics. At the time, as I said, there was a lot of skepticism about these arguments. But we kept going. We kept publishing new data, kept plugging away with this clean electricity message. And I'm very pleased to report that a month ago, our federal government has now published a national electricity strategy. Our Prime Minister has now personally made the commitment to double Canada's electricity grid, with a vast majority of this new power coming from clean electricity. And in the strategy, our federal government has underlined, and I quote here, electric machines are 2 to 4 times more efficient than those that run on fuel. And because they're more efficient, the average Canadian can save money on their total energy needs over time. So at a time of white-hot concern by Canadians and every other human on the planet related to affordability, we've made some progress now over the last few years embedding clean electricity as part of that affordability solution. So our Climate Council has sowed the seeds of this clean electricity idea. We grew the argument, and in the months ahead, it's now our task to clinch the deal on the broad electrification of the Canadian economy. I want to introduce now 4 colleagues, 4 incredibly hardworking colleagues who will share some of their recent stories of positive climate change impacts from their 3 countries. They're each going to just take the stage in turn. So when one is finished, please, the next one come on up. First, you're going to hear from Dr. Sandra Cortez, who's president of the Chilean Scientific Advisory Committee on Climate Change. You're going to hear from Dr. Andrei Katura, who's head of the Green Transition Office in the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine. And you're going to hear from Abigail Kutayar, CEO of Malta's Climate Change Authority, and David Shwireb, a board member of Malta's National Climate Action Council. Please give it up for these incredible individuals. And Sandra, come on up. Come on up. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're just going to come up when I'm
Should we start with Andrew?
No, you can start. Let's start off. Yeah, thanks so much.
Good. So, there.
Yes,
Okay.
stand
Okay.
Yeah.
It's going to be yes,
Yeah,
together. Do you want maybe a mic?
Yes, okay.
All right, great. So, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. We're here, both of us, we're here together because obviously we're representing different sectors in Malta. I wanted to first of all thank also the network because we're not newcomers anymore because we've been here last year. However, we're very small in the huge network. And something which was emphasized previously was that there's no size fits all. And that specifically is targeted also towards us because we're so small that some people might say, but what is the actual impact that Malta can actually influence with regards to climate action? And to these people, I say one thing. Yes, maybe the impact in terms of emissions, in terms of the contribution to emissions might be small. But the vulnerability that small island states, and we're not a developing state, let alone developing states, can actually have is very, very large. And that's why when we speak, we can't just focus on mitigation, but we also have to start speeding up the process on adaptation. Governance, as you rightfully said, might not be the sexy word. However, we are held accountable as governments, because I'm representing the authority, for action. If we speak a lot and we tend to continue talking and talking about how governance should work, about how policies should be undermined, about how regulations should be implemented, but ultimately citizens need action. And this is why we're here as well today, because through the support of a network like the ICCN, we are finding ourselves to be more supported and also to be more coordinated, not just as Malta or as a continent, but also with other continents across the world, so to say. We're focusing on a lot of different matters, but as an authority, we also are focusing on climate finance and the effect of risk as well on different projects. We are also tapping into private finance and how that private finance can actually lead to projects, even governmental projects, because the truth is that there's lots of private capital that is laying there and not being underutilized. So we're also looking at a climate action fund from where the money can actually be reinvested in the people themselves. But we're not doing this in isolation. That's why we have the network, the Climate Action Council, who's there with us and who's there to also review what we're doing and also ultimately pinch the government when there needs to be the realignment. So, to you.
Yeah. So thank you, Abigail. So I'm very happy to be here for many reasons. One, because I realize that this network of ours, the council of ours in Malta, forms part of a network of like-minded individuals. This is a journey that we all are seeking to learn, to be better at, and doing it together through a network like this is important to us. The council that I represent is made up of independent individuals, university professors, people coming from the areas of finance, of economy, engineering, and so on. And of course, our role is independent. This is the credibility and the value we add to the work of the authority, and the value that we add in the journey of transformation. Malta may be uniquely, and maybe you will smirk at this, but is doing really well economically. That in itself is a good thing, but in some ways is also a bad thing. When you're doing really well, you don't really care about the need for transformation, you're doing well. And our role is to show that if we really want an economy that wants to remain competitive or become more competitive and certainly more productive, and keeping the well-being of its individuals in mind, it needs to transform. And the fact that we have all of these experts in our country coming together in our council to provide advice and keep government to account and the authority to account is probably one of the better ways of how to keep ourselves on track. Keeping future generations in mind is absolutely important. I mean, I heard so many things this morning that in a way inspired me, but also reassured me that our thinking is complete and right. Because the decisions that we take today are, of course, not short-term. In the world of politics, where short-termism is probably the only winning formula, we have seen lately in this country what long-termism can do to you. That's scary, from the light of people who are looking at medium to long-term ambitions. And also in a little country like ours, who is vulnerable to the impacts of climate, but doing really well economically. So, as we go along, our real driver is risk, ESG. How do we describe that? There's risk. But also, how do we remain competitive? Like Mario Draghi said to the rest of the European Union, the way we will retain a jurisdiction competitive is through productivity, is through it being competitive, through digitalization and the green transition. So we use that as a mantra to reassure, to reinforce, to support the Climate Action Authority, but also to reassure the politicians as they describe the transition into what we want to see in the medium to long term.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much, ICCN and E3G for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Andriy Kitura. I'm the head of Green Transition Office. It's a secretariat for Climate Council in Ukraine. I will take only a few of your minutes. First of all, I want to say that over past year, Ukraine has achieved some significant for us milestones in climate policy. I will just count a couple of them, but it's important for next statements. We have updated National Energy and Climate Plan of Ukraine. In practice, it's like a roadmap, very detailed roadmap, how we are going to achieve our climate targets till 2030. This year, we updated it, taking into account our reality, war reality, plus our different implications for Ukraine recovery. We have prepared and adopted long-term low-emission development strategy adopted by the government. This strategy has time frame to 2050. It's based on NSCP and the same modeling and approach. This is our long-term vision and more practical applications have to move forward with that. We have adopted framework regulation and needed institutional capacity for Article 6 project in Ukraine. Our next step would be to move forward with our partners. As of now, like it's Switzerland and Japan, but we will be happy to discuss with any other countries which potentially may be interested. Concrete steps in identification, particular projects and their implementation. We have relaunch mandatory MRV in Ukraine, GHG emission monitoring, reporting, and verification. Because of full-scale Russian invasion, we stopped reporting and monitoring in this regard because it was literally not possible. But last year, we managed to accomplish inventory of installations which still survived and keep working. Based on that, we are going to collect data. And my next statement will be regarding the future implementation of emission trading system. This year, we prepared needed legislation. Now it's open for discussions. We have received feedbacks from the EU Commission. For Ukraine, it's a huge challenge to implement ETS right now, but like based on data for factual emissions, we are going to have a pilot phase, couple years of pilot phase, and afterwards, hopefully, we'll join the EU emission trading system. Also, during last year, we had some progress on implementation of EU acquis, and this is our long-term way to become EU member states. As I was asked to pick something like one single achievement, I would say that we have incorporated climate change in Ukraine strategy and practice. In other words, we make decarbonization as a business case in Ukraine during the war, not tomorrow, not after the war, not taking into account some additional conditions, but right now. What does it mean in practice? We built more than 80 biogas facilities in Ukraine, most of them during full-scale Russian invasion. So we are using agriculture residuals, producing renewable electricity in Ukraine, and sometimes biomethane, and exporting it to the EU. We built more than gigawatt of added capacity in wind and solar generation. For this year, government secured support funding for another gigawatt of generation based on renewables in Ukraine. But I also must mention our team supported government with concrete advices how to incorporate climate consideration in public management, in public investment management, and our government last year adopted it. So each recovery project in Ukraine, starting from 2026, will pass through analysis of climate risks. Whether we are building a new school, a new road, a new hospital, or something larger, we must take into account potential risks from environmental and climate perspectives. We incorporate climate change in our strategies and practice. As I said, we structured our discussions with IFIs, taking into account our climate targets as well. In other words, like a couple of years ago, our key message or key strategy was like, we must find out how to survive. Now it a little bit changed. We will survive, and decarbonization is our way to survive as well. Not only one, but a very crucial part of it. And like for us, fossil fuel phase out is not just a nice rhetoric. It's a question of our national security, to be honest. And I can go further. I truly believe that for entire world, move out from fossil fuels will limit the resources of authoritarian leaders and countries and make our life safer and more comfortable. So let's keep working on that. Let's try to achieve it as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Sandra Cortés. I'm the president of the Scientific Committee on Climate Change in Chile. I would like to comment you that Chile is a small country in South America, and also we are facing several extreme events, and obviously we know that we have health impacts in our people. As an example, 80% of the population are exposed to air pollution regarding the use of a wood fitting system in their houses, and also regarding the transport and used car. And also we have several inequity conditions, social conditions, environmental inequities, similar to other South American countries. In this context, our past Chilean governments had the visions to develop and approve a law on climate change, and we are part of the institutions that was created with this law. We are 10 scientists from different disciplines, from different universities, and we work a lot, especially to advise the Ministry of Environment to ensure that all the actions taken in my countries are based on the best available evidence, following the IPCC recommendations. And I would like to share our experience during the last year, because we have to review the NDC. And in this process, we could elaborate and recommend several actions, especially focused in improve the indicators and all the system to to have a good implementation of all the measures. And for us was very amazing, show that these recommendations were included at least in 50% in the government document, in the final document. And also for us was very interesting to include several recommendations to protect and promote health impacts in people, to reduce the health impacts in people, considering the physical and mental health. And also we include some recommendations about to protect especially the most vulnerable groups, children, workers, and pregnant women. And also we put on the NDC an special emphasis to consider the climatic emergency as a public health emergency. To do this work and for improving transparency and public engagement, during all this process, we made a public call to other researchers working in other universities and in other kind of research, not only quantitative, also we include qualitative researchers, to put their knowledge in our recommendations. In this activity, we could mobilize about 200 researchers, and all of them were working with us to prepare these recommendations and also try to include some specific issues for improving the national and subnational adaptations and mitigation plans. For us, it was very important to know and feel that we are not alone. We are working also giving advices for teachers working in outreach activities and leading educative projects on climate science in different schools in our country. And that was amazing. It was amazing to know experience with children speaking as very important questions from their territories. Now we are continuing working together in advance in the implementation. You know, it's not easy. And we are planning clear mechanisms for improving our work and developing strategies for maintaining as main functions as independent advisors for our country. And we are very open to share our experience, especially for other Latin American countries, because we know that our voice is very important for taking decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks, Rick, and all the colleagues from the Climate Councils, and to everyone who has joined us and spoken today. It feels like in a increasingly complex and dangerous world that you are absolutely the people that I want working on my side, the institutions that I want on my side for future generations. So thank you for being here today. We do want you to stay, and we have a very cool room downstairs that has lunch waiting for you and lots more conversation. So do stay and make sure you're nice and cool before you head back out into the red alert in London. I just wanted to close very briefly to say a huge thanks and appreciation to the E3G and ICCN teams who've organized this event, particularly shout out to Liz, Jordan, and Izzy. And also a huge thank you to our partners. We don't do this work alone. And thank you to the support from Global Challenges Foundation, the European Climate Foundation, Wellcome Foundation, the collaboration with International IDEA and the TAI Collaborative. So thanks to all of you for coming today, and please join us for lunch, and huge appreciation for your participation in the Climate Governance Forum 2026.